My name is Courtney Olson. I am 33 years old. 6 months ago, my father-in-law stood at the center of a Manhattan charity gala, leaned into a microphone, and told a room of 500 elite investors that I needed to know my place. He sneered that a woman with my modest background would never truly be one of them. The ballroom erupted in laughter. My husband clinked his champagne glass in agreement, choosing his family over our marriage. I did not shed a single tear. I just smiled politely, turned my back, and walked out into the freezing New York rain. They thought they had broken me. They had no idea I spent my days as the lead acquisitions architect for Vanguard Apex, a global equity titan, or that half a year later, they would be trapped inside my boardroom, begging for financial salvation. Before I share exactly how I dismantled their arrogant empire, let me know your age and where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe to Emily Told Stories if you have ever had to stand up to toxic relatives who drastically underestimated your worth. The heavy brass tumblers of the solid oak doors clicked shut with a deafening thud, severing all ties to the outside world. Inside the austere glass-walled boardroom of Vanguard Apex, the silence was suffocating. My father-in-law, Lawrence Caldwell, sat at the edge of his cold leather stool. A single bead of sweat traced the line of his jaw, soaking into his starched white collar. He tugged at his silk tie, his breathing shallow and rapid. Beside him, my husband Spencer stared blankly at the petrified wood table, his hands trembling so badly he had to interlock his fingers to hide the shaking. Carter, the ruthless legal counsel, and my brother-in-law rhythmically tapped a gold pen against his knee, his eyes darting frantically toward the locked exit. They were drowning in toxic debt, minutes away from insolvency. They had come to this fortress of private equity desperately seeking a faceless executive who held the power to grant them a multi-million-dollar lifeline. They expected a savior. The sharp, rhythmic click of my heels echoed down the pristine corridor. The heavy oak doors swung open. I stepped out of the shadows and into the stark, fluorescent light of the boardroom. I was no longer wearing the understated off-the-rack dresses they forced me to wear to their society events. I wore a razor-sharp charcoal power suit, the fabric moving like armor as I walked. Lawrence raised his head. The remaining color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly translucent gray. His jaw slackened. Spencer let out a strangled gasp, gripping the edge of the table as if the floor had vanished beneath him. Carter dropped his gold pen. It clattered noisily against the stone tiles. They froze in profound horror, their minds unable to comprehend why the unassuming woman they had so casually discarded was standing in the epicenter of global financial power. I did not pause. I bypassed their trembling forms and took my seat in the high-backed executive chair at the head of the table. I folded my hands over their falsified bailout application. I looked directly into Lawrence's terrified, bloodshot eyes. "You told me to know my place, Lawrence." I kept my voice soft, letting the lethal calm carry across the quiet room. Welcome to it. To understand exactly how the mighty Caldwell dynasty ended up locked inside my corporate cage, we have to go back to the night they made the fatal mistake of pushing me too far. 6 months before the doors locked them inside my boardroom, the air tasted of expensive perfume and aged champagne. The venue was a penthouse ballroom overlooking the dark, sprawling expanse of Central Park. Golden light cascaded from towering crystal chandeliers, illuminating a sea of tailored tuxedos and silk designer gowns. Waiters moved silently across the polished marble floors, carrying heavy silver trays adorned with caviar and delicate crystal flutes. It was the annual Caldwell Wealth Strategies Charity Gala, a night dedicated entirely to performative philanthropy. The elites of Manhattan finance gathered not to give back, but to secure their social standing and bask in their own reflected glory. I stood near a towering floral arrangement near the perimeter of the room, holding a glass of sparkling water. I wore a simple black evening gown I had purchased off the rack at a mid-tier department store. The fabric was unpretentious, deliberately chosen to blend into the background. For 5 years, I had curated this exact aesthetic. I wanted to exist as an ordinary woman. When I met Spencer at a quiet coffee shop in Lower Manhattan, I hid my corporate identity behind a carefully constructed facade of a low-level data analyst. My daily reality involved orchestrating billion-dollar acquisitions for a global equity titan, but I craved a sanctuary away from the transactional nature of my profession. I wanted a partner who valued my intellect and character, someone uncorrupted by the gravity of my true net worth. I truly believed Spencer was different from the predatory men I encountered in boardrooms. Looking across the ballroom, the illusion I had maintained for half a decade began to fracture. Spencer stood near the main bar, laughing loudly with a group of hedge fund managers. He looked immaculate in his bespoke tuxedo, every inch the heir to the Caldwell empire. But his posture was rigid, hyper-focused on mirroring the men around him. He thrived on their validation, constantly adjusting his cuffs and flashing a practiced hollow smile. He was a chameleon, shifting his personality to match whatever the wealthiest person in the room demanded. At the center of the room, holding court like a feudal king, was my father-in-law. Lawrence Caldwell possessed a terrifying presence. He was a man who measured human worth strictly by pedigree and bank accounts. He despised my modest background from the day Spencer introduced us. To Lawrence, I was a genetic and financial liability, an unsightly weed growing in his manicured garden. Beside him stood his wife, Victoria, her neck dripping in heavy diamonds. Victoria viewed me with icy disdain, often treating me like a poorly trained servant who had accidentally wandered into her estate. Standing near them was his son-in-law, Carter, the firm's legal counsel, who sipped bourbon with a calculating, predatory stare. A sharp clinking sound echoed through the sound system. Lawrence tapped his champagne flute with a silver spoon. The low hum of networking and jazz music faded into a hushed, reverent silence. 500 faces turned toward the main podium. Lawrence adjusted his microphone, his chest puffed with unearned superiority. "Thank you all for gathering tonight," Lawrence began, his voice booming across the silent ballroom. "We are here to celebrate generosity. We are here to remember that those of us blessed with superior acumen have a duty to elevate the world around us. Success in our industry is never an accident. It is the result of exceptional breeding, relentless discipline, and a commitment to preserving our elite standard." The crowd offered polite, scattered applause. I kept my gaze fixed on my water glass, anticipating a standard pivot toward their charitable foundation. Instead, Lawrence turned his head. His eyes scanned the room, cutting through the crowd until they locked directly onto me. A cruel, predatory smirk curled the corners of his mouth. "Of course, true charity takes many forms," Lawrence continued, his tone shifting into a theatrical, mocking cadence. "My son Spencer has always embraced our philanthropic mission. In fact, he brought it directly into our family. He could have chosen a partner from any of the prestigious bloodlines in this room tonight. Instead, he chose a woman from the bottom rung of the corporate ladder." The air in the ballroom grew thick. A few guests exchanged uncomfortable glances, but nobody spoke. Lawrence raised his glass higher, gesturing explicitly in my direction. "Spencer gave her our name a taste of a lifestyle she could never achieve on her own, and a seat at our table. But you cannot polish a river stone and expect it to shine like a diamond. So let this be a lesson about charity. You can dress someone up in borrowed elegance, but they must always remember to know their place. You will never be one of us. The venom in his words hung suspended in the chilled air. For a fraction of a second, the room was dead silent. Then a prominent venture capitalist near the front row chuckled. It was the spark the room needed. The polite discomfort instantly morphed into cruel, unrestrained amusement. 500 of New York's most influential elites erupted into laughter, openly mocking the unassuming woman standing by the floral arrangement. My face burned, a physical heat rising in my cheeks. I looked desperately across the room, searching for the man who had promised to protect me. I needed Spencer to step forward, to take the microphone from his father, to demand respect for his wife. I waited for him to prove that our marriage meant more than his toxic need for parental approval. Spencer did not step forward. He did not look angry. He locked eyes with me from across the room. A cowardly, patronizing smirk spread across his face. He raised his crystal flute toward his father and clinked his glass in enthusiastic agreement. In that single, devastating moment, the foundation of our 5-year marriage disintegrated into dust. The man I loved vanished, replaced by a spineless parasite feeding on his father's arrogance. As Spencer lowered his arm, the harsh light of the crystal chandeliers caught a flash of metal on his wrist. My eyes zeroed in on the detail. It was a rare, limited edition platinum watch from a boutique Swiss watchmaker. I recognized the specific model immediately. A timepiece that retailed for exactly $150,000. It was a staggering, inexplicable purchase for a junior executive whose wealth management firm was currently missing its quarterly projections. My analytical mind, honed by years of ruthless forensic accounting and corporate audits, instantly filed that anomaly away. The financial math did not align with his legitimate salary. He was wearing an asset that should not exist in his portfolio. I did not break down in tears. I did not scream or run out of the room in disgrace. I stood my ground under the glaring spotlight of their ridicule. I looked at Lawrence, then at Victoria and Carter, and finally back to Spencer. I offered them a chillingly polite smile. It was a serene expression devoid of any human warmth. I turned on my heel and walked toward the exit. The heavy mahogany doors swung open, and I stepped out of the suffocating ballroom, leaving their cruel laughter behind. The November air hit me like a physical blow as I walked onto the city pavement. A freezing, relentless rain was washing over Manhattan. I did not bother opening an umbrella. I let the icy water soak into my hair and my off-the-rack gown. I raised my hand and hailed a passing yellow cab. I slid into the back seat, giving the driver the address to my private, secure loft in Tribeca, a property the Caldwells did not know existed. As the cab merged into the slick city traffic, my phone buzzed in my clutch. I pulled the device out and illuminated the screen. It was a text message from Spencer. "Do not bother coming back to the estate tonight," the message read. "You embarrassed my father by walking out during his toast. If you do not apologize by tomorrow morning, I am freezing the shared credit cards. You can learn how to survive on your own pathetic salary." I stared at the glowing text. A petty, vindictive financial threat from a man who believed he controlled my existence. He thought stripping away my access to his bank accounts would force me to my knees. He assumed I was a helpless dependent who would crawl back and beg for forgiveness because I lacked the resources to survive independently. The last lingering thread of my emotional attachment snapped, severed cleanly by his sheer arrogance. The betrayal no longer hurt. It crystallized into a sharp, unforgiving focus. Spencer and Lawrence had just declared war on a woman they believed was entirely defenseless. They did not realize they had just awoken a predator. They believed their wealth shielded them from consequences. They thought they were the most powerful men in New York. They had no idea they were shadowboxing a phantom. I locked the screen of my phone and watched the rain streak across the taxi window. I was no longer a heartbroken wife playing a role to secure a normal life. I was a corporate executioner returning to her true domain. I was going to aim my resources directly at their fragile, performative empire, and I was going to tear their entire fraudulent world down to the studs. The yellow cab pulled to a halt on a quiet cobblestone street in Tribeca. I paid the fare in cash and stepped out into the freezing downpour. I bypassed the ornate lobbies of the neighboring high-rises and approached a nondescript, reinforced steel door set into a plain brick facade. A retinal scanner, hidden beneath a dark metal panel, flashed a brief green light, granting me entry into a private industrial elevator. The steel doors slid shut, carrying me upward into my actual reality. My loft spanned the entire top floor. It was a fortress of exposed brick, floor-to-ceiling, soundproof glass, and minimalist steel architecture. The space lacked the suffocating, gilded opulence the Caldwell family worshipped. This sanctuary was designed for function, clarity, and unyielding security. I peeled the wet, clinging fabric of the off-the-rack gown from my skin, dropping it onto the dark hardwood floor like a discarded shell. I walked into my sprawling dressing room and pulled on a pair of soft cashmere trousers and a fitted black turtleneck. I was trading a theatrical costume for my physical armor. For half a decade, I kept this sanctuary hidden from my husband. I maintained a strict firewall between my marriage and my profession. To Spencer, I was a mid-level data analyst, crunching basic numbers for a modest local firm. In truth, I operated as the lead stealth acquisition strategist for Vanguard Apex. We were the apex predators of the private equity sector, a shadowy institutional behemoth that orchestrated corporate takeovers on a global scale. My identity was strictly shielded by ironclad non-disclosure agreements and a labyrinth of proxy boards. I chose this double life because I craved authenticity. Surrounded daily by ruthless corporate raiders and sycophants, I wanted a partner who valued my intellect, my humor, and my character, untouched by the gravitational pull of $1 billion portfolio. I wanted a genuine connection. Tonight, Spencer shattered that fragile illusion. He proved he was just another parasite drawn to the brightest, shallowest light in the room. The dream of a normal life evaporated, leaving behind a chilling, singular focus. I poured a glass of neat scotch and walked toward the far end of the loft. A sleek, custom-built desk anchored the room, holding a curved multi-monitor terminal. I pressed my thumb against the biometric sensor. The screens flared to life, casting a pale blue glow across my face. The encrypted Vanguard network hummed, awaiting my command. For 5 years, I respected the boundaries of my marriage. I never once pointed my proprietary forensic algorithms toward Caldwell Wealth Strategies. I took their proclaimed billionaire status at face value, assuming their insufferable arrogance was at least backed by legitimate financial acumen. That grace period was officially over. I opened a secure command terminal and typed in the primary routing identifiers for my father-in-law's firm. The digital architecture of Caldwell Wealth Strategies began to unfold across my screens. At first glance, their public filings presented a picture of robust health. They boasted pristine balance sheets, glowing quarterly reports, and the client roster filled with Manhattan old money elites. But I did not deal in public filings. I deployed a specialized data mining protocol I had written specifically to bypass superficial accounting tricks. I sent the algorithm plunging into their shadow ledgers, slipping past their standard firewalls with terrifying ease. I watched the green text cascade down my primary monitor, parsing through years of tax returns, holding accounts, and corporate loan agreements. The first warning sign appeared within 10 minutes. A sharp red indicator blinked on the secondary screen, flagging a severe liquidity deficit. I leaned closer, my eyes scanning the raw data. Lawrence Caldwell projected the image of a titan with unlimited capital, yet his firm internal cash reserves were shockingly hollow. The algorithm traced the origin of the financial rot away from the glittering skyscrapers of New York City, routing the data hundreds of miles away to the tranquil, forested landscapes of upstate New York. I pulled up the specific subsidiary holding company. It was tied to a sweeping, ambitious commercial real estate venture nestled in the Finger Lakes region. Lawrence had attempted to build an exclusive, ultra-luxury resort and wellness retreat, seeking to monetize the pristine mountains and deep blue waters for his wealthy peers. The project was a catastrophic failure. The data painted a vivid picture of a sinking ship. The soil assessments had been forged, the construction was years behind schedule, and severe environmental fines were bleeding the firm dry. The ground beneath their luxury resort was literally swallowing their capital. To keep the project afloat and hide the disaster from his elite investors, Lawrence had leveraged every single performing asset his company possessed. He cross-collateralized the firm Manhattan headquarters, maxed out their corporate credit lines, and secured predatory bridge loans with exorbitant interest rates. The Caldwells were not billionaires. They were walking corpses buried under a mountain of toxic debt. Crimson alerts multiplied across my screens, illuminating the dark loft with the glaring proof of their impending insolvency. They were highly overleveraged, teetering on the very edge of a financial cliff. One missed payment, one strict margin call, and the entire Caldwell legacy would collapse into a spectacular pile of ash. The arrogance Lawrence displayed at the gala suddenly made perfect sense. It was the loud posturing of a terrified man trying to distract the world from his hollow core. He mocked my lack of pedigree to elevate his own fragile ego, knowing deep down that his elite empire was nothing but smoke and mirrors. However, poor business acumen was merely a civil failing. As I dug deeper into the upstate real estate ledgers, a far more sinister pattern emerged from the digital noise. The math did not add up. The predatory loans they secured were immense, yet the capital flowing into the failing Finger Lakes resort was only a fraction of what they had borrowed. Millions of dollars were inexplicably vanishing from the corporate treasury before ever reaching the construction site. The men who laughed at me were not just terrible investors. They were running a white-collar criminal enterprise, hiding their theft behind tailored suits and charity galas. I narrowed my search parameters, targeting the missing capital. My fingers flew across the keyboard, tracing a tangled web of dummy corporations designed to wash the money clean. A specific routing number caught my eye. It was an offshore entity nestled in the Cayman Islands. I ran a cross-reference on the authorized signatory for that hidden account. The name that appeared on my screen was not Lawrence or Spencer. It was Carter, the firm's smug legal counsel, and my brother-in-law. I opened the transaction history for that hidden offshore account. A recent, highly specific withdrawal flashed across the screen. It was a solitary charge for exactly $150,000. The precise retail price of the limited edition platinum watch Spencer wore while raising his glass to my humiliation. The pieces clicked into a lethal sequence, confirming that the rot inside the Caldwell family went much deeper than a failed real estate venture. The glowing blue light of my terminal reflected off the floor-to-ceiling windows of my Tribeca loft. The relentless storm battered the glass, mirroring the cold precision taking shape inside my mind. I stared at the isolated transaction glowing on my secondary monitor. $150,000. The exact retail price of the platinum timepiece Spencer had flashed at the charity gala. It was a staggering sum for a junior executive, but the origin of those funds transformed a mere vanity purchase into a federal crime. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard, unleashing a secondary wave of proprietary decryption algorithms. I needed to see the entire structural foundation of their deceit. For 5 years, I had played the quiet, unassuming wife, enduring their condescending remarks over Sunday dinners. Carter, my brother-in-law, and the firm chief legal counsel always sat at the head of those tables, right next to Lawrence. Carter possessed a sharp, predatory intellect, often offering me patronizing career advice while swirling expensive bourbon in his crystal glass. He projected the image of a loyal, brilliant strategist protecting the Caldwell legacy. The digital footprints I was uncovering painted a vastly different portrait. I bypassed the superficial holding accounts and dove straight into the encrypted core of Caldwell Wealth Strategies. What I found was a labyrinth of falsified wire transfers and hollow shell companies. The architecture was intricate, designed to confuse standard regulatory audits. But Vanguard Apex did not use standard tools. My software sliced through the layers of corporate camouflage, revealing the true flow of capital. The failing commercial real estate venture in the Finger Lakes was draining their liquidity. But the hemorrhage was not just due to bad investments. Carter was actively bleeding the firm dry from the inside out. I isolated a series of recurring wire transfers initiated over the past 8 months. The money was not coming from their corporate reserves. Carter was systematically siphoning funds from vulnerable client escrow accounts. He was raiding the life savings of elderly investors, draining conservative retirement portfolios, and funneling the stolen capital through a dozen untraceable proxy servers. The final destination was a hidden offshore trust registered in the Cayman Islands. I leaned closer to the monitor, my eyes scanning the authorization signatures on those fraudulent transfers. A chilling realization washed over me. The authorized digital signatures did not belong to Carter. Every single illicit wire transfer bore the verified electronic credentials of Lawrence and Spencer. The plot was as brilliant as it was ruthless. Carter knew the upstate New York real estate disaster was weeks away from triggering a catastrophic collapse. He recognized that the firm was standing on the precipice of ruin. Instead of trying to save the sinking ship, the esteemed legal counsel was packing his own parachute. By routing the stolen client funds using his father-in-law and brother-in-law digital signatures, Carter was meticulously framing them for the entire embezzlement scheme. When the regulators inevitably descended on the firm, the paper trail would lead directly to Lawrence and Spencer. They would face the full wrath of the Securities and Exchange Commission, while Carter would quietly slip away to the Caribbean, a wealthy and innocent victim of his in-laws' gross negligence. I pulled up the metadata attached to the Cayman Islands Trust. My screen populated with Carter's recent internet activity, intercepted through a back door I had just pried open in his personal legal server. He was finalizing a residency application for a luxury expatriate community in Grand Cayman. He had already purchased a sprawling beachfront property through an anonymous LLC. The rat was preparing his escape, leaving his family to burn in the federal inferno he had helped ignite. My gaze drifted back to the initial anomaly, the $150,000 transfer. I opened the specific ledger entry tracing the route of that single payout. Carter had approved a distinct wire transfer from the stolen client escrow pool, funneling it directly into Spencer's private checking account. Carter had cleverly labeled the transaction as a discretionary consulting bonus. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, visualizing the profound arrogance of my husband. Spencer lacked the intellectual depth to question a sudden influx of cash. He craved validation and status above all else. When that fraudulent bonus hit his account, he did not ask his brother-in-law where the liquidity originated. He did not care that the firm was supposedly struggling to meet basic overhead costs. Spencer simply saw a number on a screen and immediately drove to a luxury boutique to purchase a limited edition platinum watch. He wore that stolen asset on his wrist while raising his glass to mock my modest background. He stood in a ballroom full of Manhattan elites, seeking their applause, entirely oblivious to the fact that he was flaunting the explicit proof of his own federal crimes. His shallow vanity had provided Carter with the perfect, undeniable link. By accepting and spending those stolen funds, Spencer had cemented his role as a co-conspirator on paper. His need to look wealthy was his own federal death warrant. A profound, icy detachment settled over my chest. I was no longer an injured spouse contemplating a quiet divorce. I was an apex predator observing wounded, corrupted prey. The betrayal of our marriage felt distant, overshadowed by the sheer magnitude of their legal and moral bankruptcy. They were thieves, dressed in bespoke suits, stealing from the vulnerable to fund their performative elitism. I reached for my cold cup of coffee, taking a slow sip as I formulated my strategy. I was not going to simply hand this information over to a divorce attorney. I was going to construct an inescapable federal trap. I opened a new, highly encrypted partition on my secure server. I began compiling the digital dossier, dragging and dropping every falsified ledger, every forged signature, and every offshore routing number into the vault. I meticulously organized the evidence, structuring it not just as a financial report, but as a prosecutorial roadmap. I documented the exact flow of the stolen escrow funds, tying the Cayman Islands Trust irrevocably to the Caldwell network. But gathering the evidence was only the first phase. I needed to ensure the cage was locked before they even realized they were trapped. I targeted Carter's hidden escape routes. Utilizing a proprietary Vanguard routing override, I quietly infiltrated the banking protocols linking the Caldwell firm to the Cayman Islands Trust. I did not freeze the accounts. That would alert Carter too early. Instead, I erected a silent, invisible digital wall around the offshore funds. I rewrote the exit parameters. Carter could continue to look at his stolen millions on a screen, but the moment he attempted to initiate a withdrawal or transfer the capital to a physical bank, the transaction would instantly route into a locked Vanguard holding account. He believed he was a mastermind pulling the strings of his doomed family. He had no idea he was now operating entirely inside a sandbox I had built. His beachfront property in the Caribbean would remain an empty dream. When the Caldwell empire finally imploded, Carter would reach for his golden parachute only to find the cords had been severed. Every single one of them would be trapped inside the burning wreckage of their own arrogance. I finalized the encryption on the dossier and locked the terminal. The storm outside had begun to recede, giving way to the pale, creeping light of a Manhattan dawn. The city was waking up, entirely ignorant of the quiet execution I had just set in motion. The men who demanded I know my place were already financially dead. They just had not received the obituary yet. While I sat in the serene quiet of my Tribeca loft, securing the final nails in their corporate coffin, the women of the Caldwell family were waking up in their opulent Upper East Side estates. Unaware of the impending federal ruin, they were preparing to launch a very different kind of war. They believed my silence was a sign of weakness, an invitation to destroy the fragile civilian life they thought was my only refuge. While I fortified the digital cage around Carter and his stolen offshore accounts, the women of the Caldwell family awoke in their sprawling Upper East Side estates, entirely ignorant of their impending federal ruin. Believing my silence overnight was a symptom of cowardice, they decided to launch a coordinated, vindictive strike against my civilian facade. They operated under the delusion that stripping away my social standing would force me to crawl back to their doorstep, begging for the meager scraps of their approval. The assault began at the Wellington Heritage Club, a prestigious, centuries-old institution situated in the heart of Manhattan. Victoria, my mother-in-law, ruled this specific enclave as the reigning president of the board. The club was her personal kingdom, a place where high society matrons gathered to sip imported tea and dictate the social hierarchy of the city. Victoria derived her entire sense of self-worth from the velvet ropes and exclusionary membership policies of the Wellington. She wielded her influence like a blunt instrument, and this morning, I was her chosen target. Sitting in the opulent oak room, surrounded by fresh white lilies and a captive audience of wealthy sycophants, Victoria began spinning a masterclass in character assassination. She portrayed herself as the devastated, betrayed matriarch. She told her peers that Spencer had finally uncovered my true nature. According to her fabricated narrative, I was an unstable, deceitful social climber who had suffered a severe mental breakdown during the charity gala. She claimed I had been secretly siphoning Spencer personal funds to cover up my own incompetence, and that Lauren's heroic toast was actually a desperate intervention to save his son from a volatile gold digger. Her audience absorbed every word, their eyes wide with performative scandal. In their insular world, truth was irrelevant. The only currency that mattered was proximity to power, and the Caldwell name still projected the illusion of invincibility. Audrey Spencer, younger sister, sat right beside their mother, eagerly pouring fuel onto the fabricated fire. Audrey had never worked a legitimate day in her life, surviving exclusively on an allowance she wrongly believed would last forever. Eager to participate in my destruction, she pulled out her phone and boasted to the table about her own retaliatory actions. She proudly announced that she had just called the Human Resources Department of my mid-level data analytics firm. Utilizing the heavy weight of her family name, Audrey threatened to pull the Caldwell investment portfolio from their client roster unless I was terminated immediately for unprofessional conduct. They laughed together, clinking porcelain teacups, genuinely believing they were dismantling my entire livelihood. They envisioned me sitting in a cramped apartment, weeping over a cardboard box of desk supplies. Back in the quiet, climate-controlled sanctuary of my Tribeca loft, my encrypted mobile device began to illuminate with the fallout of their petty social warfare. I stood by the kitchen island, slowly sipping a cup of black espresso, watching the notifications cascade across the screen. The first alert was a formal, chillingly polite email from the Metropolitan Children Foundation. It was a philanthropic board I had genuinely enjoyed serving on, dedicating my weekends to organizing literacy programs. The message informed me that my membership was being revoked, effective immediately, citing vague concerns regarding recent public behavior that did not align with their core values. Victoria influence had reached the charity sector, erasing my name from their registries before breakfast. The second notification was a text message from Audrey. It read, "Good luck finding work in this city. You are finished." The sheer absurdity of her threat almost made me smile. The mid-level data analytics firm she had so fiercely threatened did not actually exist as an independent entity. It was a carefully constructed shell company owned and operated by Vanguard Apex, designed specifically to provide my undercover identity with a verifiable tax trail. The bewildered human resources representative Audrey had berated was actually a Vanguard security operative playing along with the ruse. Audrey thought she was destroying my career. In reality, she was simply shouting into a corporate void, shadowboxing a phantom that Vanguard had manufactured. Then came the voicemail from Spencer. I tapped the screen and pressed the phone to my ear, listening to the voice of the man I had spent 5 years trusting. "You brought this on yourself, Courtney." His tone was dripping with unearned superiority and condescension. "My mother is scrubbing you from every guest list in Manhattan. Audrey handled your little consulting job. You have no income, no friends, and no place in our world. You are going to pack a bag, come back to the estate, and apologize to my father in front of the entire staff. If you show proper remorse, I might convince them to call off the dogs. I will expect you by noon." I lowered the device and set it face down on the marble countertop. Spencer believed he held all the cards. He thought isolating me socially and financially would break my spirit. He could not comprehend that a woman might possess an identity independent of her husband's last name. I did not feel an ounce of sorrow over losing the country club memberships or the elite dinner invitations. Those superficial gatherings always felt like a suffocating costume I was forced to wear. The only tragedy was that they genuinely believed their social ostracization was a lethal weapon. They were throwing pebbles at a fortress utterly blind to the heavy artillery slowly aiming directly at their fragile glass house. I walked away from the kitchen and returned to my multi-monitor terminal. I brushed my thumb across the biometric scanner, waking the Vanguard network. If Victoria wanted to use the Wellington Heritage Club as her personal execution block, it was only fitting that I took a closer look at the foundation she was standing on. I bypassed my forensic audit of the Caldwell firm and initiated a deep structural review of the country club financial health. Elite Manhattan institutions often projected an aura of limitless old money, but their ledgers frequently told a story of desperate, quiet survival. The Wellington was no exception. The data populated across my secondary screen in crisp green text. 3 years ago, the club board of directors authorized a sweeping, extravagant renovation of their dining halls and private golf facilities. To fund the aesthetic upgrades, they secured a staggering $50 million commercial mortgage from a prominent regional bank. The loan terms were brutal, banking entirely on a projected increase in high-tier memberships that never materialized. The Wellington was struggling to meet its quarterly debt obligations, constantly restructuring the payments to avoid defaulting. The regional bank holding their mortgage had recently bundled that debt into a larger portfolio of distressed commercial mortgage-backed securities, quietly listing it on the institutional secondary market. They wanted to offload the risk. I sat back in my ergonomic chair, a slow, calculated realization washing over my thoughts. Victoria was currently holding court in the Oak Room, drinking mimosas and reveling in her perceived dominance over my life. She derived her entire societal power from her position within those historic walls. I leaned forward and opened the secure Vanguard Apex acquisition portal. I did not need to schedule a board meeting or seek committee approval. As the executive vice president of acquisitions, I possessed unilateral authority over distressed asset purchases under $100 million. I typed in the specific identification codes for the bundled securities containing the Wellington Heritage Club mortgage. The system prompted me for a final authorization signature. I typed my name, confirming the institutional transfer of capital from a Vanguard subsidiary directly to the regional bank. The transaction processed in less than 10 seconds. The green confirmation window flared on my screen, casting a cool light across my face. It was a silent, invisible shift of global capital. Nobody inside the opulent dining hall felt the tremor. The crystal chandeliers did not shake, and the porcelain teacups did not rattle. Yet the fundamental reality of their universe had just been entirely rewritten. I now held the primary debt portfolio for the Wellington Heritage Club. I owned the very walls Victoria Caldwell was standing within. I controlled the financial leverage that could force the institution into immediate foreclosure, dissolve the board of directors, and lock the brass gates permanently. She was spinning her petty, venomous rumors in a building that belonged to the woman she was desperately trying to destroy. I allowed them to gloat in their insulated echo chamber. Their unchecked arrogance was my greatest tactical advantage. By letting the Caldwells believe they were successfully crushing my spirit, I ensured they would not look over their shoulders. They would keep their eyes focused on their superficial victories, remaining blissfully ignorant of the catastrophic fall waiting for them. My encrypted phone chimed again, breaking the silence of the loft. It was another text message from Spencer. The tone had shifted slightly, moving from outright command to impatient irritation. "We need to discuss the legal parameters of a temporary separation," his message read. "Meet Carter and me at the espresso bar near the financial district in 1 hour. Do not be late." I stared at the glowing text. Spencer and Carter were changing their tactics. Having supposedly stripped me of my social standing and my income, they believed I was sufficiently tenderized. They thought I was arriving at that espresso bar as a defeated, impoverished woman, ready to accept whatever scraps they threw onto the table. They were preparing to serve me with a predatory legal ambush, aiming to sever my ties to their impending ruin. I locked my terminal, walked back into my dressing room, and selected a tailored wool coat. They wanted a wounded civilian. I was going to give them exactly what they expected. Walking straight into their trap with the keys to their destruction hidden securely in my pocket. The espresso bar near the financial district hummed with the low murmur of bankers on their lunch breaks. The air smelled of roasted beans and damp wool coats. I sat at a small corner table, nursing a plain black coffee. I wore my tailored wool coat, projecting the image of a woman trying to maintain a shred of dignity in the face of ruin. The glass door of the cafe swung open, letting in a gust of chilling wind. Spencer and Carter stepped inside, shaking the rain from their bespoke umbrellas. They scanned the room, moving with the synchronized swagger of men who believed they owned the city block. To execute a flawless corporate strike, you must grant your enemies the illusion of total control. I needed Carter and Spencer to believe their coordinated social blacklist had worked. They needed to see me as a desperate, terrified woman running out of options. Before stepping out of my loft, I initiated a deliberate misdirection. I scoured the internet for the most incompetent legal representation available in the 5 boroughs. I found a strip mall divorce attorney in Queens whose website featured a blurry photograph and a heavily discounted consultation fee. Using a disposable phone, I paid his retainer and instructed him to send a preliminary notice of separation to the Caldwell Legal Department. I had intercepted Carter's email server earlier that week, so I watched the delivery of the letter in real time. The document was a masterpiece of amateur incompetence. It contained 3 spelling errors in the first paragraph, cited outdated matrimonial case law, and used formatting that looked like it was typed on a broken typewriter. My screens captured Carter forwarding the email to Spencer with a string of laughing emojis. The accompanying text read that the poor girl was scraping the bottom of the legal barrel. Their egos swelled, inflating their confidence to a dangerous threshold. They dropped their guard, entirely convinced I lacked the capital to hire a real litigator. They walked into the afternoon meeting, believing they were about to swat a harmless fly. Spencer spotted me and sneered. He did not bother ordering a drink. He marched directly to my table and slid into the chair opposite mine. Carter took the seat beside him, placing a thick leather briefcase onto the pristine marble tabletop. They looked immaculate, wrapped in dark Italian wool and crisp silk ties, a stark contrast to the casual patrons around us. The visual disparity was intentional on their part. They wanted to shrink my presence to remind me of the elite world they had just exiled me from. Spencer leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. He inspected my face, perhaps looking for tear stains or signs of sleep deprivation. I kept my expression hollow, offering him a blank, apathetic canvas. "You look tired," Courtney Spencer remarked, his tone dripping with patronizing faux sympathy. "Living outside the estate must be taking a toll already. I warned you about the consequences of embarrassing my father. Now your little consulting job is gone. Your country club friends have stopped returning your calls, and your bank accounts are locked. You played a stupid game and you lost." I said nothing. I let the silence stretch, forcing Carter to take the reins. The lawyer unclasped his briefcase with a sharp, metallic snap. He withdrew a thick stack of premium legal paper, setting it squarely between us. "We are not here to debate your mistakes. Carter stated smoothly, tapping his manicured fingers against the document. "We are here to offer you a lifeline. Spencer is a generous man, despite your erratic behavior at the gala. We want to wrap this up quickly, avoiding a messy public divorce that will only humiliate you further. This is a standard post-nuptial settlement agreement." Carter reached into his breast pocket, but instead of retrieving his customary gold fountain pen, he pulled out a cheap, chewed-up plastic ballpoint pen. He tossed it onto the table. It clattered against the marble, rolling until it hit the edge of my coffee cup. The gesture was a calculated insult, a physical manifestation of my perceived worthlessness. "Sign the document," Carter instructed, fixing me with a predatory stare. "It outlines a clean break." I picked up the document, ignoring the plastic pen. I scanned the first page, my eyes darting across the dense legal jargon. The clauses were not standard. They were draconian. The contract was engineered to retroactively strip away the modest personal savings I held in my civilian checking accounts. It demanded I forfeit any claim to the cars, the estate, and the contents of our shared safety deposit boxes. Furthermore, Carter had embedded a permanent gag order threatening punitive damages if I ever spoke about the Caldwell family business practices to the press or any regulatory agency. Spencer watched me read, misinterpreting my focused silence for mounting despair. He leaned closer, invading my personal space, lowering his voice to a venomous whisper. "Do not even think about fighting this," Spencer threatened. "Your pathetic strip mall lawyer cannot help you here. If you refuse to sign today, Carter will bury you in endless litigation. We will drag this out for years. I will ensure every single cent you ever earn is garnished to pay our legal fees. You will be bankrupted, Courtney. You will end up sleeping on the streets, begging for spare change. Sign the paper. Take the $5,000 relocation stipend we are offering, and disappear." His threats washed over me, devoid of any real weight. I continued turning the pages, maintaining my chilling, detached demeanor. While Spencer spewed insults, my mind dissected the underlying architecture of their legal trap. Why would a family supposedly worth billions care about extracting my meager civilian savings? Why embed a gag order with such severe, desperate language? The realization clicked into place with the precision of a tumbling vault lock. This post-nuptial agreement was not an act of vengeance. It was an act of profound, unadulterated panic. Lawrence, Spencer, and Carter knew their upstate New York commercial real estate venture was collapsing. They knew they were hemorrhaging cash and facing an imminent default. In the event of a catastrophic bankruptcy, a spouse could potentially claim a stake in the remaining liquidated assets or demand an investigative audit during divorce discovery. An audit would instantly expose Carter client embezzlement and the forged signature loans. They were terrified that I, the discarded wife, might accidentally stumble upon their federal crimes if I hired a competent litigator to examine their books. They needed to sever my legal ties to the Caldwell Holding Company before the impending implosion. They were attempting to amputate a limb to save the infected body. The aggression, the social blacklisting, the coordinated intimidation tactics, all of it was designed to force my signature on this specific piece of paper today, ensuring I could never look under the hood of their sinking vehicle. I flipped to the final section of the contract. The tension at the table reached a boiling point. Carter tapped the marble surface, his impatience leaking through his polished veneer. "We have a very important meeting scheduled this afternoon," Carter pressed, checking his expensive watch. "We do not have time to sit here while you pretend to understand complex legalese. Pick up the pen, Courtney. Your signature is the only thing standing between you and total financial ruin." Spencer smirked, crossing his arms over his chest. "You should thank us," he added. "We are letting you walk away intact. Try to fight us, and I promise, you will regret the day we met. I stared at the thick stack of premium paper. I looked at the cheap plastic pen resting against my coffee cup. I looked at the two arrogant men sitting across from me, radiating false supremacy. They believed they had orchestrated the perfect ambush. They thought they were backing a helpless animal into a corner. They had no idea they were shoving a loaded weapon directly into my hands. I ran my eyes over a very specific, highly unusual clause Carter had buried deep within the liability section of the settlement. It was a clause that changed the entire dynamic of the war. My eyes scanned the dense paragraphs of the settlement, tracing the intricate legal framework Carter had constructed. He was a ruthless corporate litigator, a man who built his entire reputation on drafting airtight contracts that suffocated the opposition. He structured this document to be a flawless shield for the Caldwell Empire. I turned to page 14. My gaze landing on a highly specific provision buried deep within the liability waivers. Section 4, subparagraph C. It was a mutual indemnification clause regarding encumbrances and financial obligations. The text explicitly dictated that upon affixing my signature, both parties permanently waived all rights to each other's marital assets. But Carter, driven by an intense paranoia that I might somehow lay claim to the firm's accounts, took the legal language one step further. He drafted a reciprocal barrier. The clause stipulated that neither party could be held responsible for the financial liabilities pending litigations or outstanding debts incurred by the other, either prior to or following the dissolution of the marriage. It was the ultimate legal trap. But the snare was facing the wrong direction. Carter believed he was barricading the vault doors to keep an impoverished gold digger away from the family treasury. He failed to comprehend that the treasury was already empty, replaced by a ticking time bomb of toxic leverage. The upstate New York commercial real estate disaster was bleeding their liquidity dry. The firm was days away from a monumental default that would trigger a cascading chain reaction of margin calls. When those creditors came collecting, they would pierce the corporate veil and seize personal assets to satisfy the staggering deficits. If I refused to sign this postnuptial agreement, my legal status as Spencer's wife would leave me tethered to his impending financial ruin. I would be dragged down into the abyss of his bankruptcy, my own hidden billions exposed to the relentless scrutiny of bankruptcy courts and federal auditors. By demanding my signature on this exact document, Carter was handing me a pair of titanium shears and begging me to cut the cord binding me to their sinking ship. I kept my face entirely impassive. I did not let a single micro-expression betray the profound satisfaction blooming inside my chest. Spencer sat across from me, bouncing his leg in a rhythm of barely contained impatience. He checked the reflection of his tailored collar in the dark screen of his smartphone, his vanity overriding any genuine concern for the woman he had spent 5 years calling his wife. "Are you having trouble understanding the big words?" Courtney Spencer taunted, a venomous smirk playing on his lips. I know legal jargon can be confusing for someone who spent her career organizing spreadsheets in a cubicle. We can wait a few more minutes if you need to sound it out. Or you could just save us all some time and sign the paper. Carter steepled his manicured fingers together, resting his chin on his hands. He watched me with the unblinking stare of a predator confident in its kill. "The terms are non-negotiable," Carter added, his tone dripping with fake professionalism. "We are offering you a clean break, a chance to walk away with a small relocation stipend. If you decide to fight this in court, I promise you will spend the next decade drowning in legal fees. We will freeze your civilian checking accounts by sunset. You will not have the funds to rent a studio apartment in Queens, let alone hire a litigator to challenge my firm. Take the pen." They expected a theatrical display of defiance. They anticipated I would burst into tears, beg for a larger settlement, or angrily rip the premium paper to shreds in a futile show of working-class pride. They wanted to relish the sight of a broken woman thrashing against a cage she could never escape. I reached across the pristine marble table. My fingers brushed against the cheap, chewed-up plastic ballpoint pen Carter had tossed at me. I picked it up. The plastic felt flimsy and insignificant, a perfect physical representation of the men sitting across from me. I clicked the pen. The sharp, tiny sound cut through the ambient noise of the bustling espresso bar. Spencer raised an eyebrow, his smug expression faltering for a fraction of a second, surprised by my lack of resistance. I pulled the thick stack of documents closer. I did not hesitate. I pressed the tip of the cheap pen against the signature line on the final page. The blue ink flowed smoothly over the expensive cardstock. I signed my full legal name with crisp, deliberate strokes. I flipped back to the initial pages, placing my initials exactly where Carter had placed his small yellow adhesive flags. Every stroke of the pen severed another link to their fraudulent dynasty. Every signature was a brick added to the legal firewall protecting my true empire from their imminent destruction. I finished the final initial and capped the pen. I placed it neatly on top of the executed contract and slid the entire stack across the marble table toward Carter. Spencer let out a harsh, barking laugh. He leaned back in his chair, throwing his arms open in a gesture of triumphant victory. "I told you she would fold," Spencer declared, looking at his brother-in-law with unfiltered glee. "She knows she has zero leverage. She is nothing without our name. Enjoy the subway ride back to whatever miserable hole you crawled out of, Courtney. Make sure you stretch that $5,000 stipend. It is the last dime of Caldwell money you will ever see." Carter snatched the documents off the table, his eyes quickly verifying the signatures. A satisfied, arrogant smile spread across his face as he secured the paperwork inside his leather briefcase. He snapped the golden clasps shut, sealing his own fate. "A pleasure doing business with you," Carter mocked, standing up and buttoning his bespoke wool coat. They had no idea they had just anchored themselves to the ocean floor. By forcing my signature on that mutual indemnification clause, they legally insulated me from the fallout of their catastrophic real estate default. More importantly, they isolated Spencer. When the federal investigators inevitably discovered the forged signatures on the embezzled client funds, Spencer would stand entirely alone. He possessed zero legal recourse to claim I was a co-conspirator or beneficiary of his stolen wealth. He demanded 100% of the Caldwell assets, which meant he just legally inherited 100% of the Caldwell liabilities. I stood up from the small cafe chair. I buttoned my wool coat, ignoring the icy draft sweeping through the espresso bar. I did not utter a single syllable. Silence is the most terrifying response you can offer a narcissist. It deprives them of the validation they crave. It leaves them questioning the solidity of their own triumph. I turned my back on them and walked toward the glass exit. I pushed the door open and stepped out onto the bustling financial district sidewalk. The cold wind bit into my cheeks, but I felt a soaring, untouchable warmth radiating from within. I glanced back through the cafe window. Spencer and Carter were high-fiving, ordering a round of expensive espresso to celebrate their masterful negotiation. They were raising their cups to the total ruin they had just inflicted upon themselves. My phone vibrated in my coat pocket. I pulled it out and glanced at the secure screen. It was a high-priority notification from the Vanguard Apex executive scheduling system. Lawrence Caldwell had just formally accepted the invitation for an emergency in-person review regarding his desperate $200 million bailout application. The meeting was set for tomorrow morning at the Vanguard Global headquarters. The pieces were perfectly aligned on the board. The Caldwell men were currently celebrating a worthless postnuptial agreement, entirely oblivious that their firm was bleeding out, and their only remaining lifeline was held by the woman they just exiled. They believed they were marching into a routine corporate negotiation tomorrow, preparing to charm a faceless private equity titan into saving their legacy. They did not know the boardroom was a carefully constructed slaughterhouse, and they were sprinting directly toward the open doors. The sanctuary of my executive suite on the 70th floor of Vanguard Apex headquarters provided a staggering contrast to the noisy espresso bar I had just left. Here the air was filtered and silent. The panoramic windows offered an unobstructed view of the Manhattan skyline, a sprawling grid of glass and steel that I navigated with surgical precision. I draped my wool coat over the back of a suede armchair and took my seat behind a sleek, unadorned obsidian desk. 3 oversized monitors awaited my attention, their dark screens holding the fragile fate of the men who had just mocked me. The financial rot consuming Caldwell Wealth Strategies had reached a critical, irreversible threshold. My proprietary algorithms flagged a synchronized countdown ticking away in the shadows of their corporate ledgers. Their commercial real estate venture in the tranquil Finger Lakes region was exactly 48 hours away from a catastrophic default. The project was originally pitched to their investors as an ultra-exclusive wellness retreat, a crown jewel in their portfolio. In reality, the construction site was a bottomless sinkhole. Severe zoning violations halted permits, and a structurally compromised foundation had drained their liquidity over the past 18 months. Lawrence had desperately secured a colossal bridge loan from a syndicate of shadow lenders to keep the construction moving. That specific loan carried predatory interest rates and a brutal balloon payment due by the end of the fiscal week. If the Caldwell firm missed that deadline, the lenders would execute their foreclosure rights. The resulting shockwave would trigger cross-default clauses across their entire portfolio, allowing creditors to seize their Manhattan headquarters and freeze their remaining assets. Lawrence was staring down the barrel of institutional ruin and federal prison. To avoid the impending slaughter, he needed an immediate cash injection of $200 million. My secure mobile device vibrated against the polished surface of my desk. A new voicemail icon appeared on the screen. It was Spencer. I tapped the icon and engaged the speakerphone, leaning back in my leather chair to listen. "I wanted to leave you one final message before I block this number." Spencer began, his voice dripping with unearned triumph and smug satisfaction. "You thought you could cause a scene at the gala and walk away with half my net worth. Instead, you handed me the keys to a clean slate. You really should have hired a better lawyer, Courtney. But I suppose that requires capital you simply do not possess." A sharp, breathless chuckle echoed through the phone speaker. Spencer was pacing, likely striding around his expansive corner office, high on the adrenaline of our recent coffee shop encounter. "My father and I are securing a monumental private equity bailout this afternoon," Spencer boasted, his tone inflating with sheer arrogance. "We are finalizing a deal with Vanguard Apex. You have probably never heard of them since your career involves fetching coffee and typing data into spreadsheets. They are a legendary equity titan. They are injecting $200 million into our firm, which will propel our valuation into the stratosphere. I am playing a game of high-level finance you could never even begin to comprehend. Enjoy your miserable, impoverished life." The voicemail ended with a harsh beep. The silence returned to my executive suite, heavy with the most profound, delicious irony imaginable. Spencer believed he was lecturing a defeated, uneducated civilian. He had no earthly idea that the woman he just insulted was the exact executive currently holding his desperate, falsified application on her secure monitor. I shifted my gaze to the primary screen. The official bailout request from Caldwell Wealth Strategies glared back at me. Lawrence had bypassed the standard commercial banks, knowing their rigorous underwriting departments would instantly detect his forged liquidity metrics. He came crawling to Vanguard Apex because we were renowned for executing lightning-fast acquisitions, provided the applicant offered favorable terms. I opened the attached financial statements. The audacity of their deception was staggering. Lawrence had directed Carter to bundle the embezzled client escrow funds, listing the stolen capital as unencumbered cash on hand. They presented a balance sheet padded with phantom assets, attempting to trick the most sophisticated private equity firm on the Eastern Seaboard. They were committing blatant wire fraud, submitting falsified federal documents in a blind, frantic bid for survival. To comprehend the true depth of their panic, I accessed the Central Vanguard Communication Hub. My security clearance allowed me to intercept the direct email traffic routed to our general underwriting inbox. I pulled up the correspondence initiated by Lawrence over the past 3 days. The patriarch who had stood at a podium and sneered at my lack of pedigree was currently groveling in the digital void. His emails grew increasingly frantic with each passing hour. He started by offering a standard minority equity stake in exchange for the capital. When Vanguard automated systems failed to respond swiftly, his offers became absurd. He promised preferred voting rights, a seat on his executive board, and unprecedented control over their client portfolios. He practically begged for an expedited review, utilizing language so desperate it bordered on pathetic. The illusion of the untouchable New York billionaire was entirely stripped away, exposing a terrified old man willing to sell his soul to keep his facade intact. A standard risk assessment analyst at Vanguard would review this file, spot the glaring inconsistencies in the offshore routing numbers, and deny the application within 10 minutes. They would flag the Caldwell firm for potential fraud and toss the request into the digital trash bin. I could not allow that to happen. A simple, automated rejection letter sent to their inbox was insufficient. It lacked the visceral, face-to-face accountability they deserved. I needed them to walk willingly into a trap they could not talk their way out of. I needed them inside my building, sitting at my table when the federal guillotine finally dropped. I moved my hand over the keyboard and initiated a Level 1 executive override. The screen flashed a bright warning notifying me that bypassing the preliminary audit phase carried significant institutional risk. I authorized the command using my encrypted biometric signature. I forcefully pulled the Caldwell application out of the general underwriting queue, securing it exclusively under my personal administrative portfolio. I permanently blocked any other Vanguard analyst from reviewing the forged documents. The digital path was cleared. Now I needed to set the bait. I opened a blank, formal corporate template bearing the imposing Vanguard Apex crest. I crafted a sterile, highly professional response directed to Lawrence's private inbox. I congratulated him on passing the initial automated liquidity screening. I noted that his aggressive equity offerings were highly appealing to our senior partners. I purposefully used the precise corporate jargon that men like Lawrence and Spencer relied upon to validate their egos. The final paragraph contained the lethal hook. I formally invited Lawrence Spencer and their legal counsel, Carter, to attend an immediate in-person executive review at the Vanguard Apex Global Headquarters. I scheduled the meeting for the following morning, leaving them less than 24 hours to prepare. I stated that the final signing ceremony for the $200 million capital injection would commence upon their arrival. I read through the invitation one last time, ensuring the tone was perfectly devoid of any human emotion. It was a masterpiece of corporate misdirection. They would read this email and pop open bottles of vintage champagne, believing they had successfully outsmarted the entire financial system. They would spend the evening celebrating their unparalleled brilliance, entirely unaware that the woman they had banished to the streets had just scheduled their corporate execution. I clicked the send button. The email vanished into the ether, hurtling toward their inbox. The trap was officially set, but allowing them to enjoy a peaceful night of celebration felt far too generous. They needed to feel the icy grip of reality before they walked into my boardroom. They needed to understand that the ground beneath their feet was already crumbling. As I turned my attention back to my encrypted terminal, I prepared to execute a silent, targeted strike against their personal wealth, ensuring their victory lap would be interrupted by a very harsh, very public dose of humiliation. The formal invitation sat in Lawrence Caldwell's inbox, a digital Trojan horse, waiting to breach their crumbling fortress. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, watching the red receipt confirm he had opened the message. The bait was taken. They believed salvation was imminent, scheduled for 9 o'clock the next morning. However, letting them enjoy a peaceful evening of unearned celebration felt far too generous. The Caldwell family operated on the arrogant assumption that wealth insulated them from consequence. It was time to strip away that insulation and let them feel the bitter chill of the real world. Vanguard Apex did not solely govern private equity buyouts. Our sweeping institutional umbrella covered several primary credit clearinghouses and elite consumer banking subsidiaries. We processed the invisible data streams that kept high society functioning. Using my executive clearance, I bypassed standard banking protocols and accessed the master consumer ledger tied to Caldwell Wealth Strategies. Lawrence had foolishly tied his firm's failing commercial real estate loans to his family's personal checking accounts and luxury credit lines. He used his private wealth as a desperate collateral buffer. I highlighted the entire web of connected accounts linking Spencer Victoria and Audrey to the toxic debt. I engaged a specialized compliance protocol flagging every single routing number for severe cross-collateralization fraud. I did not just lower their limits. I ordered a hard, undeniable institutional freeze. My finger tapped the enter key. The execution was entirely silent within the soundproof walls of my office, but the shock wave radiated outward with devastating speed, hurtling toward the Upper East Side. Miles away, on the most expensive stretch of Madison Avenue, Victoria and Audrey were busy celebrating their imaginary victory. The Caldwell women treated shopping as a competitive sport, a way to visually assert their dominance over their peers. They stood inside the private viewing room of a renowned bespoke jeweler, surrounded by velvet display cases and armed security guards. Victoria projected the image of a seasoned aristocrat. She wore a tailored cashmere coat, her posture rigid with entitlement. Audrey mirrored her mother's haughty demeanor, holding a crystal flute of complimentary champagne. They were preparing for the Vanguard signing ceremony, intent on purchasing items that screamed untouchable prosperity. Victoria pointed a manicured finger at a heavy diamond collar necklace resting on a black velvet bust. Audrey selected a pair of platinum chandelier earrings. The combined total hovered near $250,000, a sum they deemed appropriate for tomorrow's triumph. The boutique director, a polished man in a pristine charcoal suit, smiled warmly as he tallied the exorbitant purchase. He presented the leather billing folio. Victoria barely glanced at the receipt. She reached into her designer handbag and produced her heavy titanium executive card, dropping it onto the glass counter with a sharp, entitled clack. The director inserted the metal card into the encrypted payment terminal. He waited for the familiar chime of approval. Instead, the machine emitted a harsh, piercing beep. A glaring red error message flashed across the digital display. The polite smile on the director's face faltered. He discreetly pulled the card out, polished the electronic chip on his silk sleeve, and inserted it a second time. The machine beeped again, louder this time, in the quiet showroom. The red text read, "Transaction denied. Account locked." Victoria let out an irritated sigh, shifting her weight. She hated waiting. She demanded to know why the machine was malfunctioning, raising her voice loud enough for the other elite patrons in the main showroom to hear. Several wealthy socialites women Victoria frequently sparred with at her country club paused their browsing to watch the unfolding drama. The boutique director lowered his voice, attempting to preserve her dignity. He politely informed her that the issuing bank had placed a strict block on the account. He asked if she could provide an alternative method of payment. Audrey scoffed, rolling her eyes. She pulled out her own gold card tied to her trust fund and shoved it toward the terminal. The director swiped it. The machine rejected it instantly. Panic began to crack Victoria's pristine facade. The murmurs from the main showroom grew louder. The wealthy onlookers exchanged eager whispered comments, recognizing the ultimate mark of high society disgrace. A declined card in this zip code was not a mere inconvenience. It was a neon sign of impending ruin. The director slid the cards across the glass counter, refusing to meet Victoria's eyes. He asked them to step aside, requesting they vacate the private viewing room so he could assist paying clients. The dismissal was swift and devastating. Victoria snatched the plastic from the counter, her face flushing a deep, humiliating crimson. She grabbed Audrey by the arm and marched out of the boutique, keeping her head down as the quiet laughter of her peers burned into her back. The financial suffocation did not stop on Madison Avenue. In the heart of the financial district, Spencer was hosting a celebratory dinner at an exclusive members-only cigar lounge. He had gathered 3 junior executives from competing firms, eager to brag about the impending Vanguard bailout. He ordered imported steaks and rare scotch, playing the role of the visionary leader steering his company through turbulent waters. When the leather-bound check arrived, Spencer tossed his corporate card onto the silver tray without looking at the total. The server returned 3 minutes later, standing awkwardly beside the mahogany table. The server leaned down and whispered that the card had been declined. Spencer's smug grin vanished. He felt a sudden cold knot forming in his stomach. He handed the server his personal debit card, offering a forced laugh to his guests, blaming a routine fraud alert. The server returned again, shaking his head. Forced to excuse himself, Spencer hurried to the quiet lobby of the lounge. He pulled out his phone and opened his mobile banking application. The screen loaded, replacing his robust balances with a stark, terrifying message. His checking, savings, and investment portfolios all displayed a 0 available balance. A banner at the top of the screen instructed him to contact the fraud department immediately regarding a severe compliance violation. The walls of his insulated reality began to close in. Spencer tried calling the bank's elite concierge line, but the automated system informed him his access privileges had been suspended. He stood in the dimly lit hallway, his heart hammering against his ribs, staring at a screen that confirmed he did not have enough liquid cash to cover a cab ride home. Back at the Caldwell estate, the family gathered in the grand foyer, their earlier triumph replaced by frantic confusion. Victoria paced across the marble floor, clutching her useless credit cards, demanding answers. Audrey sat on the stairs, refreshing her banking app with trembling fingers, watching the red error message persist. Spencer stormed through the front door, looking pale and erratic. He found Lawrence standing by the fireplace, gripping a crystal tumbler of whiskey. Spencer shouted that something was wrong, explaining that every single account tied to their names was locked. He asked his father if the upstate lenders had initiated an early seizure. Lawrence held up a steadying hand, projecting a false, desperate calm. He refused to entertain the idea of a targeted attack. The patriarch insisted this was a standard institutional compliance measure. He theorized that Vanguard Apex was simply auditing their capital reserves ahead of the morning signing ceremony. Lawrence assured his panicked family that large-scale equity transfers often triggered automated holds on connected consumer accounts. They grabbed onto his flawed logic like a lifeline. It was easier to blame a temporary algorithmic glitch than to accept the terrifying alternative. They convinced themselves the financial drought would only last the night. They reassured each other that the moment Lawrence signed the Vanguard contract, the $200 million would flood their system, unlocking their accounts and elevating them to untouchable status. They chose to remain blind, clinging desperately to their unearned arrogance. They were standing on a trap door, convincing themselves it was a pedestal. I watched the rapid succession of denied transactions populate across my terminal. The raw data told a beautiful story of escalating panic. I tracked Spencer's rejected dinner bill, Victoria's failed jewelry purchase, and a dozen other blocked attempts to access their frozen wealth. The preliminary strike was a flawless success. I had stripped them of their purchasing power, rendering them vulnerable and entirely dependent on tomorrow's meeting. However, locking their checking accounts was merely a temporary discomfort. It punished their vanity, but it did not guarantee their permanent destruction. The Caldwell men were cornered animals. If they walked into my boardroom and realized the bailout was a mirage, their survival instincts would kick in. Carter would immediately attempt to flee the jurisdiction. Lawrence would deploy his expensive legal team to stall the bankruptcy proceedings, burying the embezzlement evidence under years of civil litigation. I could not allow them a single route of escape. The corporate execution needed to be backed by the inescapable weight of federal law. I minimized the banking ledgers and opened a pristine, heavily encrypted partition on my hard drive. The digital dossier containing the undeniable proof of their white-collar criminal enterprise was fully compiled. It was time to shift the battlefield from private equity to federal justice, preparing a strike so devastating they would never see the sunshine on Wall Street again. The glowing numerals on my secondary monitor bathed the dark loft in a pale blue light. The financial suffocation of the Caldwell family was already underway, evidenced by their rejected credit cards and locked consumer accounts. Yet restricting their purchasing power was merely a preliminary skirmish. Denying them the ability to buy designer jewelry or expensive steaks served as a temporary psychological blow. To achieve enduring justice, the battlefield required a profound shift. I needed to move beyond corporate retaliation and invoke the inescapable weight of federal law. I opened a sterile, heavily encrypted partition on my hard drive. This secure vault housed the culmination of my forensic investigation. Corporate espionage and white-collar crime often thrive in the gray areas of regulatory oversight, shielded by complex legal jargon and obscure tax loopholes. Men like my father-in-law relied on this ambiguity to escape accountability. Lawrence assumed his vast wealth and social connections granted him immunity from the consequences that governed ordinary citizens. He operated under the delusion that stealing millions from working-class investors was a victimless maneuver, provided the paperwork looked pristine. I intended to shatter that delusion using his own verified data. I began compiling the digital dossier. The first inclusion focused on Carter. The firm-esteemed legal counsel possessed degrees from elite Ivy League institutions, breeding an inherent belief that his intellect was impenetrable. He treated digital laundering as an art form, burying transactions beneath countless layers of offshore corporate shielding. He never anticipated facing a proprietary algorithm designed to strip those layers away in seconds. I attached the irrefutable proof of his embezzlement, linking the stolen client escrow funds directly to his hidden Caribbean trust. The routing numbers, the timestamps, and the specific IP addresses utilized to initiate the transfers were all meticulously documented. Next, I targeted the forged regulatory filings. Lawrence ran his wealth management firm with an iron fist, demanding unwavering loyalty over ethical compliance. He had personally signed the quarterly liquidity reports submitted to federal regulators. Those documents falsely inflated their cash reserves to mask the bleeding upstate New York real estate venture. I placed the authentic, disastrous balance sheets side by side with the doctored versions he had authorized. The juxtaposition painted a stark, undeniable portrait of systemic corporate fraud. He had lied to the government. a felony, carrying severe mandatory sentencing. Finally, that included the damning evidence against my husband. Spencer had accepted a stolen $150,000 payout disguised as a consulting bonus and used it to purchase a platinum watch. I attached the receipt, the wire transfer confirmation, and a photograph of Spencer wearing the stolen asset at the charity gala. It was the perfect bow on a highly toxic package. Corporate revenge alone was insufficient. Seizing their company would wound their towering egos, but resilient parasites always find new hosts. Given enough time and freedom, they would leverage their remaining social capital to secure new loans, start fresh ventures, and rebrand their catastrophic failure as a minor market setback. I refused to leave them a single avenue of return. I was constructing an inescapable federal cage, ensuring their punishment mirrored the severity of their crimes. I opened a secure communication protocol linking my terminal to the whistleblower portal of the Securities and Exchange Commission Enforcement Division. Submitting an anonymous tip required meticulous caution to avoid tracing the origin back to my Tribeca loft or Vanguard Apex. I routed the data packet through a series of encrypted proxy servers. The signal bounced from a data center in Tokyo, crossed a node in Zurich, and slipped through a firewall in Reykjavik before directing its trajectory toward the United States government servers in Washington. The payload was primed, but the execution required flawless synchronization. If I transmitted the dossier tonight, the regulatory agency might process the information immediately. They would likely dispatch tactical teams to Caldwell Wealth Strategies right at the opening bell. If Lawrence, Spencer, and Carter were sitting in their corner offices when the federal agents arrived, Carter would instantly trigger his crisis management protocols. He would deploy his high-priced legal defense team, invoke attorney-client privilege, and potentially destroy physical hard drives located on site. He might even find a way to stall the investigation long enough to catch a flight to the Cayman Islands. To guarantee a clean strike, I needed to separate the generals from their fortress. The Vanguard Apex boardroom meeting served as the perfect bait. I wrote a custom execution script linking the transmission of the SEC dossier to a digital countdown clock on my monitor. I set the timer to reach zero at precisely 8:45 in the morning. The timing was a tactical masterpiece. By 8:45, the 3 Caldwell executives would be en route to my headquarters, navigating the gridlocked Manhattan traffic in their chauffeured town cars. The federal warrants would be processed, authorized, and acted upon just as they stepped into my lobby. The tactical raid on their corporate offices would commence while they were trapped inside my soundproof, signal-blocking executive suite. They would be entirely cut off from their staff, their lawyers, and their bank accounts. I pressed the enter key, engaging the script. The digital numbers flared to life on the screen, silently ticking away the remaining hours of their freedom. I sat back in the glow of the monitor, experiencing a profound sense of closure. The personal sting of Spencer betraying our marriage had evaporated, replaced by the cool satisfaction of an architect watching a flawless design take shape. They were not just losing a lucrative business. They were forfeiting their liberty. The sun began to rise over the East River, casting long shadows between the towering skyscrapers of the financial district. In their respective estates, the Caldwell men were waking up, entirely oblivious to the ticking clock hovering over their lives. They would shower, shave, and armor themselves in their finest bespoke suits. Lawrence would practice his charismatic smile in the mirror, rehearsing the opening lines of his fraudulent pitch. Carter would review his doctored legal binders, confident in his elaborate deception. Spencer would likely adjust his platinum watch, staring at his reflection with unearned pride. He still believed the frozen credit cards were a minor clerical error, a temporary hiccup in an otherwise glorious trajectory. He clung to the delusion that walking into Vanguard Apex would magically erase his toxic debt and elevate his status among the New York elite. He thought he was ascending to the pinnacle of global finance. He had no idea He was meticulously preparing for his own professional funeral. As the final seconds ticked down on my terminal, I closed my laptop and stood up. I walked into my dressing room to select my attire for the meeting. The trap was armed, the bait was swallowed. There were no lifeboats left. Now all that remained was to open the front doors of Vanguard Apex and let the predators walk straight into the cage. The morning sun cast a sharp, unforgiving glare across the geometric glass facade of Vanguard Apex headquarters. Lawrence Spencer and Carter pushed through the revolving doors, stepping into a soaring, unadorned atrium that felt less like a corporate lobby and more like a minimalist cathedral dedicated to institutional capital. They wore their finest bespoke suits, armor spun from Italian wool and imported silk, projecting a curated facade of unshakable confidence. Beneath the tailored lapels, however, a profound, chilling panic threatened to unravel their composure. The overnight freeze on their personal accounts remained unresolved, leaving them feeling naked and exposed. They walked toward the reception desk, their leather shoes clicking in unison against the pristine white marble, each step echoing in the cavernous space. Lawrence was a man accustomed to commanding respect through the trappings of old money. He built his reputation hosting negotiations in rooms paneled with rich mahogany, surrounded by antique leather armchairs and the scent of aged scotch. He used warmth and heritage to disarm his opponents, leveraging historical prestige to hide his predatory tactics. Vanguard Apex offered no such comforts. The lobby was a stark expanse of brushed steel and frosted glass. There were no plush seating areas or smiling receptionists eager to fetch coffee. The environment was cold, clinical, and reeked of true, untouchable influence. It was a space designed to remind visitors that they were insignificant gears standing inside a much larger machine. Two imposing security personnel approached the trio before they even reached the front desk. The guards wore sharp, unmarked dark suits, their expressions carved from granite. They did not offer a polite greeting or ask about the morning traffic. The lead guard simply verified Lauren's identification with a curt nod and gestured toward a private biometric elevator bank. The silence during the ascent was suffocating. The elevator shot upward at a dizzying speed, leaving the chaotic hum of the Manhattan streets far below. Spencer adjusted his silk tie, his fingers trembling slightly as he tried to mentally rehearse the opening lines of their falsified pitch. Carter stood rigidly, clutching his leather briefcase, holding the forged documents that represented their only lifeline. The elevator doors parted to reveal the 70th floor, a corridor lined with frosted glass that offered zero transparency. The guards escorted the men into an expansive boardroom overlooking the sprawling city skyline. The panoramic view was breathtaking, yet it offered no solace. It only reinforced the dizzying height from which they were operating. The room lacked the traditional opulent furnishings they expected. Instead, a single elongated table crafted from petrified wood dominated the center of the space. Surrounding the table were severe backless leather stools, rather than ergonomic executive chairs. The setup was a deliberate psychological pebble, subtly stripping them of their physical comfort and reinforcing their subordinate status. They were not guests here. They were subjects awaiting a verdict. As Carter moved to place his briefcase on the polished wood surface, he instinctively reached into his breast pocket to check his smartphone. He needed to monitor the ongoing banking glitch that had plagued their evening, desperate to know if the hold had lifted. He woke the screen, only to find a stark red symbol in the upper corner. The cell signal was entirely zero. No bars, no data connection. The thick, soundproof glass and the specialized architectural shielding of the executive suite severed their tether to the outside world. A fresh wave of anxiety washed over him, tightening his chest. Carter tapped the screen, a frown creasing his forehead. He showed the dead device to Spencer, whispering a tight, anxious remark about lacking service. Spencer checked his own phone, finding the same dead signal. This sudden isolation introduced a terrifying new dynamic. Carter had spent his entire career orchestrating digital loopholes, moving capital through Caribbean trusts with a few keystrokes. His power lived in his connectivity. Being cut off from his servers meant he was flying blind. If their accounting department encountered a crisis back at Caldwell Wealth Strategies, or if the regional bank formally initiated default proceedings on the upstate venture, they would receive no warning. They were floating in a digital void, stranded inside the fortress of their prospective savior. Lawrence ignored their murmurs regarding the phones. He unclasped his leather folio, spreading the printed copies of their pitch deck across the petrified wood. The pages contained the intricate lies Carter had woven, detailing the phantom liquidity in the stolen escrow funds categorized as legitimate assets. Lawrence smoothed the edges of the paper, his jaw clenched tight. He knew the margin for error was non-existent. They were preparing to look a legendary private equity titan in the eye and present a highly illegal fiction. If the Vanguard executive spotted a single inconsistency in the offshore routing numbers, the bailout would vanish and the federal regulators would be alerted. Lawrence turned to his son and son-in-law, his eyes flashing with a desperate, feral intensity. He leaned forward, resting his palms on the table. "We do not show a single ounce of hesitation," Lawrence instructed, his voice a low, gravelly command that barely carried over the ambient hum of the climate control. "Vanguard Apex preys on weakness. They will try to leverage our urgency to demand a larger equity stake. We must project total dominance. We are offering them a rare opportunity to partner with an established legacy. Keep your shoulders back. Speak with conviction. Do not let them control the pace of this negotiation." Spencer nodded, swallowing hard to clear the dryness in his throat. He smoothed the lapels of his bespoke jacket, trying to channel his father-manufactured bravado. He glanced down at his wrist, the heavy, platinum watch gleaming under the recessed lighting. That watch was bought with embezzled funds, a symbol of his vanity and entitlement. He believed they were about to trick a faceless corporate entity, an anonymous board of directors who only cared about profit margins and yield projections. He assumed the executive walking through those doors would be a numbers-obsessed suit, someone easily charmed by the Caldwell charisma and the illusion of aristocratic success. Carter remained tense, his legal mind churning through the variables. He organized the fraudulent balance sheets, ensuring the forged signatures were perfectly aligned for presentation. He checked his watch, noting that the meeting was scheduled to begin precisely 10 minutes ago. The deliberate delay was a classic power play, a tactic designed to let the supplicants stew in their own apprehension. It was working. The prolonged wait frayed their nerves, forcing them to sit in silence with their mounting fears. The three men sat on the uncomfortable leather stools, their breathing shallow in the suffocating silence of the soundproof enclosure. They focused all their remaining energy on maintaining their flawless exterior, entirely oblivious to the reality of their environment. They thought they had secured a seat at the most powerful table in Manhattan. They did not realize the boardroom was a perfectly constructed cage engineered specifically for their execution. A heavy metallic sound echoed behind them. The thick oak doors of the executive suite slid shut, sealing the entrance. The solid click of the deadbolt engaging resonated like a gunshot in the quiet room, physically locking them inside. The trap had sprung, leaving them isolated, cut off from their empire, and waiting for a predator they could never have anticipated. The agonizing 45-minute delay was a deliberate psychological mechanism. I monitored them through the secure internal surveillance feed from my desk down the hall. I watched Lawrence pace the length of the soundproof enclosure. He rubbed the back of his neck, the pristine veneer of the Manhattan billionaire beginning to fracture under the weight of forced isolation. Carter reviewed his forged legal binders for the 5th time, his knee bouncing in a rapid, uncontrolled rhythm. Spencer simply stared at the blank frosted glass, a man accustomed to having his every whim catered to instantly, now forced to stew in deafening silence. The environment was designed to strip away their unearned bravado. By the time the digital clock struck the final minute, their nerves were frayed and their desperation was palpable. They were primed for the harvest. The heavy oak doors at the end of the corridor unlatched with a loud, definitive click. The sound echoed into the boardroom, causing all 3 men to snap their heads toward the entrance. They sat up straight on their uncomfortable leather stools, frantically smoothing their silk ties and adjusting their bespoke jackets. They prepared their faces, plastering on charismatic, practiced smiles, expecting an imposing, gray-haired titan of Wall Street to step through the threshold. Instead, a phalanx of 5 elite corporate attorneys marched into the room. The legal team moved with synchronized predatory efficiency, wearing sharp navy suits and carrying thick manila folders secured with red federal tape. They fanned out around the perimeter of the petrified wood table, standing at rigid attention. They offered no polite introductions. They simply stared at the Caldwell men with cold, clinical hostility, establishing an immediate perimeter of intimidation. Then I crossed the threshold. I wore a razor-sharp charcoal power suit, the fabric tailored to project unyielding authority. The soft, unassuming wife who wore off-the-rack dresses and served them coffee was gone, replaced by the apex predator they had unknowingly provoked. The only sound in the vast, austere room was the sharp, rhythmic click of my heels striking the polished slate floor. Each step resonated like a gavel striking a block, counting down the final seconds of their dynasty. I walked past the phalanx of attorneys moving with a fluid, terrifying grace. I did not rush. I kept my posture perfectly straight, my gaze locked directly ahead. Lawrence stood up from his stool, his charismatic smile freezing instantly. The color drained from his face, only to return a second later in a rush of furious, indignant red. His brain, hardwired to view me as a subservient subordinate, flatly rejected the reality unfolding before his eyes. He assumed I was a hysterical, discarded woman who had somehow bypassed building security to stage a pathetic domestic dispute. His mind conjured the most convenient, misogynistic explanation to protect his fragile worldview. "What on earth do you think you are doing here?" Lawrence demanded, his voice echoing harshly off the glass walls. The patriarch pointed a trembling finger at my chest, his tone dripping with venomous entitlement. "Did you bribe someone in the lobby to let you up here? This is a secure corporate facility, you ungrateful wretch. We are in the middle of a highly confidential negotiation that dictates the future of our entire firm. Get out of this boardroom before I have you arrested for trespassing." Spencer jumped to his feet, mirroring his father's outrage. He stepped forward, raising his chin to project a false sense of dominance. "Courtney, this is pathetic," he sneered, attempting to assert control. "You cannot just follow us to a business meeting because you are bitter about the divorce. We gave you a relocation stipend. Take it and leave. You are going to ruin the most important deal of my life. Guard, remove her." I ignored their frantic outbursts entirely. Their shouts washed over me like meaningless static. Silence remained my most effective weapon. Responding to their insults would validate their delusion that we were operating on an equal playing field. We were not. I reached to the head of the table. I placed my hands on the smooth, cool surface of the petrified wood and pulled out the oversized executive chair. I sat down, leaning back against the dark leather, crossing my legs with measured precision. I rested my forearms on the armrests, interlacing my fingers. I looked at the three men standing on the opposite side of the table, letting the crushing weight of my unbothered silence suffocate their anger. Carter was the first to realize the fatal shift in gravity. The shrewd lawyer noticed the 5 elite Vanguard attorneys standing guard behind my chair, waiting for my command. He recognized that I was not a rogue intruder. The security personnel had not chased me into the room. I was leading the procession. Carter sank back onto his stool, his throat bobbing as he swallowed a sudden, terrifying lump of dread. Lawrence slammed his fist onto the table, desperate to shatter the quiet authority I commanded. He demanded answers, demanding to speak to the executive director of acquisitions. He shouted that he would not tolerate a scorned daughter-in-law playing juvenile games during a $200 million transaction. I reached into the interior pocket of my charcoal jacket. My fingers retrieved a single thick piece of premium cardstock. I pinched the edge of the card and flicked my wrist. The embossed card glided silently across the polished surface of the petrified wood table. It slowed to a halt precisely 1 inch from Spencer's trembling fingertips. "Read it," I instructed. My voice was a low, melodic whisper that carried effortlessly across the room, slicing through Lawrence's bluster like a scalpel. Spencer looked down at the table. He hesitated, his chest heaving with shallow breaths. He reached out his hand, shaking so noticeably that his expensive cufflink rattled against the wood. He picked up the heavy cardstock. His eyes focused on the silver-raised lettering. The transition from arrogance to absolute paralyzing terror happened in a fraction of a second. Spencer read the printed text. Courtney Olson, Executive Vice President of Acquisitions, Vanguard Apex. The platinum watch on his wrist, purchased with stolen funds, felt like a shackle. All the blood rushed from his face, leaving his skin a sickly translucent gray. His lips parted, but his vocal cords refused to function. He looked at me, then looked back at the card, his reality fracturing into sharp, jagged pieces. The woman he had treated as a disposable prop, the woman he had threatened to leave homeless on the streets of New York, was the sole gatekeeper to his financial salvation. He realized he had not just insulted his wife at a charity gala. He had publicly humiliated the hidden architect of a global equity titan. "What does it say?" Spencer Lawrence snapped, his patience evaporating. "What kind of trick is she playing? Read the damn card!" Spencer could not formulate a response. He simply let the card slip from his fingers. It fluttered down, landing face up in front of his father. Lawrence leaned over, squinting at the silver text. As his brain processed the title printed beneath my name, the wealthy patriarch stopped breathing. A visible tremor racked his shoulders. The towering confidence he utilized to bully regulators, intimidate rivals, and demand submission from his family instantly dissolved. He was a man who worshipped institutional power, and he suddenly understood that he was sitting in the presence of a deity he had actively scorned. I did not offer them a moment to recover. I gestured to the lead attorney standing to my right. The lawyer stepped forward, placing a thick manila folder directly in front of me. The folder contained the exact falsified liquidity application they had submitted to my firm. It was sealed with a distinct red tamper evidence strip, signaling the inclusion of federally regulated financial disclosures. I rested my hands on the folder. I looked directly into Lawrence's wide, panicked eyes, establishing a tether of undeniable dread. I hooked my finger under the edge of the red federal security tape. I pulled upward. The sharp, tearing sound of the seal breaking echoed through the silent boardroom. It sounded like a match striking in a room full of gasoline. "You demanded I know my place, Lawrence," I said, maintaining unyielding eye contact. The temperature in the room plummeted as my words hung in the air. Welcome to it. The crushing reality of their situation broke the Caldwell men simultaneously. Carter closed his eyes, accepting the destruction of his legal career. Spencer gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white as he stared into the abyss of his own arrogance. Lawrence slumped forward, his pristine posture collapsing under the realization that the empire he spent decades building was now resting entirely in the palms of my hands. They were trapped inside my fortress, their fraudulent documents splayed open on my desk, and the execution was just beginning. The silence that followed was heavy with anticipation. They waited for the inevitable reading of the charges, their minds racing to calculate the true extent of the damage I was about to unleash upon their shattered dynasty. Every single lie they had woven was about to be laid bare. I turned the thick parchment of the first page, letting the sharp rustle of premium paper amplify within the pristine silence of the boardroom. The 5 elite corporate attorneys standing behind my chair remained perfectly still, their presence forming an impenetrable wall of legal authority. Across the petrified wood table, Lawrence gripped the edge of his leather stool. His knuckles turned stark white as he watched me dismantle his fabricated empire. For decades, he had utilized his booming voice and imposing physical stature to command every room he entered. Here, stripped of his connectivity and cornered by verified data, his imposing stature withered into the hollow posture of a terrified old man. "You reported a fluid capital pool of $40 million, I stated, keeping my tone level and devoid of any soothing cadence. The words hung in the chilled air, precise and lethal. You presented these figures to Vanguard Apex as unencumbered cash on hand, ready for cross-collateralization. However, the proprietary trace initiated by my department uncovered a labyrinth of shadow ledgers. The cash reserves you submitted to federal regulators are a carefully constructed fiction. You doctored the quarterly liquidity metrics to conceal the gaping wound of your upstate commercial real estate venture. You lied to the United States government to secure a temporary lifeline." Lawrence opened his mouth, his jaw trembling as he attempted to formulate a defense. He shut it a second later. There was no argument to be made against raw, unyielding data. He was a man who relied on charm to obscure his incompetence, and charm carried zero currency in this environment. I shifted my gaze to the right, locking eyes with Carter. The shrewd legal counsel had spent the last 30 minutes frantically scanning the room for an exit strategy, calculating his personal exposure. Carter was a man who prided himself on finding loopholes, always drafting contracts designed to trap others while quietly maintaining an emergency exit for himself. He built his identity on being the smartest tactician in the room. "You possess a remarkable talent for digital misdirection, Carter," I noted, watching a bead of sweat trace a path down his temple. "You spent the past 3 months quietly siphoning vulnerable client escrow funds, moving the stolen capital through a maze of domestic dummy corporations. You thought you were a ghost in the machine. You systematically funneled those funds into a hidden trust in the Cayman Islands, preparing a golden parachute for yourself." Carter stopped breathing. His eyes darted toward Lawrence, then back to me, the color draining entirely from his usually composed features. "You booked a private charter flight scheduled for tomorrow evening." I continued reading the details from the open dossier. "You intended to vanish the moment this firm defaulted on its commercial loans. You planned to flee the jurisdiction, leaving your father-in-law and your brother-in-law to face the impending regulatory fallout alone. You were going to let them take the federal fall while you sipped cocktails on a Caribbean beach." Lawrence slowly turned his head, staring at his son-in-law with a mixture of profound shock and rising fury. The pristine family loyalty they projected to high society was unmasked as a fragile, treacherous illusion. "But your escape route is dead, Carter," I declared. I forwarded the offshore routing numbers to international banking authorities at dawn. "Your secret trust is frozen, pending a criminal audit. The charter flight is canceled. You are not going anywhere." Carter slumped forward, resting his forehead in his hands. The brilliant legal mind who had drafted the predatory postnuptial agreement designed to ruin me was now reduced to a shivering, defeated shell. I turned my attention to the center of the table. Spencer sat rigid, his breathing shallow and erratic. He tried to shrink away from my gaze, desperate to avoid the executioner block. "That is a stunning timepiece on your wrist, Spencer," I observed, gesturing slightly toward his left hand. "A limited edition platinum model, very rare, very expensive. It suits the image of a visionary executive you so desperately wish to project." Spencer instinctively pulled his arm back, attempting to hide the watch beneath the cuff of his bespoke jacket. The shame radiating from his posture was palpable. "You authorized a wire transfer of $150,000 to a luxury boutique on Fifth Avenue last week," I explained, tracing the line of data on the page. "You categorized the withdrawal as an internal consulting bonus. In reality, that money was drained directly from the pension fund of a retired school teacher who trusted your family with her life savings. You stole the security of an elderly woman to purchase a shiny toy because you needed to impress men at a cigar lounge who do not even respect you." Spencer closed his eyes, tears of sheer humiliation leaking from the corners. He was stripped of his unearned arrogance, exposed as a parasitic fraud who fed on the vulnerable to mask his own profound mediocrity. I closed the dossier. The heavy thud of the cover hitting the petrified wood signaled the end of the evidence phase. "Your request for a $200 million bailout is denied," I announced, delivering the verdict with chilling finality. "Vanguard Apex will not inject a single cent into your fraudulent enterprise. You have breached your loan covenants. You possess no remaining liquidity. Your firm will be forced to file for catastrophic bankruptcy before the markets close today. The legacy you used to justify my degradation is officially extinct." The reality of the denial crashed over Spencer like a tidal wave. The looming specter of poverty, social exile, and impending federal charges shattered his fragile ego. He could not maintain the facade of a stoic Manhattan elite for another second. Spencer pushed himself off the leather stool. His legs trembled so fiercely they could no longer support his weight. He collapsed onto the dark slate floor, landing hard on his knees. He crawled around the edge of the immense table, scrambling toward the head of the boardroom. He stopped just short of my chair, his bespoke suit gathering dust against the stone. "Courtney, please," Spencer sobbed, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, wretched plea. Tears streamed down his face, ruining his manicured appearance. "I will do anything. You cannot let them send me to prison. I will divorce my family. I will cut them off entirely." He gestured wildly toward Lawrence and Carter, desperation eradicating any remaining shred of family loyalty. "I will testify against them." Spencer wept, his hands clasped together in a pathetic prayer. "I will tell the regulators everything Carter did. I will show them how my father authorized the forged filings. Just spare me. I will sign whatever you want. Please, Courtney, I am begging you on my hands and knees. Save me." I looked down at the man I had once chosen to marry. He was offering to sell his own father to the federal government to save his own skin. He possessed no honor, no loyalty, and no backbone. "I view you with nothing but pure disgust, Spencer," I stated softly, ensuring every syllable pierced his crumbling psyche. You are a coward who hides behind the cruelty of others. I stood up, smoothing the front of my charcoal jacket. I looked past the weeping man on the floor, locking eyes with Lawrence one final time. I did not just bring you here to deny your loan, I informed the broken patriarch. Denying your application would simply force you into bankruptcy court, where you could deploy your remaining assets to drag the proceedings out for years. That was insufficient. Lawrence stared at me, his chest heaving, dread pooling in his hollow eyes. This morning, 45 minutes before you stepped into my lobby, Vanguard Apex executed a hostile takeover of your parents' holding company, I revealed. Your creditors were desperate to offload your toxic debt. We acquired the controlling shares for pennies on the dollar. I did not just reject your bailout. I bought your entire firm. The words hung in the chilled air, rewriting their reality. I legally own every asset you possess. I continued, my voice echoing with untouchable power. I own the chairs you are sitting on. I own the logo on your business cards. I own the client lists you exploited. Which means, as of this exact second, you are all officially fired. Lawrence let out a strangled, breathless gasp. The empire he built to terrorize others now belonged to the woman he told to know her place. You are stripped of your titles, your equity, and your access, I declared, signaling the lead attorney to step forward with the termination notices. You are no longer executives. You are unemployed trespassers sitting in my building. Your identity as untouchable titans of finance is erased. Now you are just criminals waiting for the authorities to arrive. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom burst open with a deafening crash before Lawrence could even process the reality of his termination. The sudden noise shattered the tense atmosphere, echoing like thunder across the dark slate floor. A tactical team of federal agents wearing dark windbreakers, bearing the bright yellow letters of the FBI and the SEC, swarmed the executive suite. They moved with a synchronized, predatory efficiency that left no room for negotiation or resistance. My anonymous digital dossier had hit the enforcement division exactly on schedule, triggering a flawless, coordinated strike. While these agents secured my boardroom, a mirrored scene was unfolding miles away at Caldwell Wealth Strategies. At this exact second, a separate federal task force was storming their pristine Manhattan lobby. Government auditors were seizing every server, locking down the corporate mainframes and confiscating hard drives before the loyal staff could shred a single document. The Caldwell Fortress was being gutted from the inside out, their illusion of untouchable prestige dismantled by federal warrants. In my suite, the lead agent bypassed the perimeter of Vanguard attorneys and marched directly toward the head of the petrified wood table. He held up a silver badge, the metallic glint catching the harsh overhead lighting. He did not care about the bespoke suits or the aristocratic lineage of the men standing before him. To the federal government, they were simply high-value targets caught in a verified web of financial deceit. Lawrence Caldwell, you are under arrest for wire fraud, securities fraud, and severe embezzlement, the agent announced, his voice projecting a rigid, uncompromising authority. The patriarch backed away, his leather shoes scraping awkwardly against the stone. The blood drained from his face, leaving a pale, sickly pallor. He raised his trembling hands, attempting to summon the booming, commanding tone he used to dominate charity galas and boardrooms. He sputtered, demanding to call his legal team, insisting this was a profound misunderstanding, fabricated by a scorned woman. The federal agent ignored the frantic protests. He grabbed Lawrence by the wrist, pulling the older man forward. The defining sound of the morning was not a shout or a gavel strike. It was the sharp, metallic click of iron handcuffs snapping shut around the billionaire wrists. That singular, heavy noise echoed off the frosted glass walls. It was the sound of a dynasty ending. Lawrence collapsed inward, his chest heaving as he began to hyperventilate. The man who had sneered at my lack of pedigree was now stripped of every ounce of his curated dignity, reduced to a panting, terrified criminal, watching his legacy burn to ash. Carter fared no better. 2 agents flanked the brilliant legal counsel, securing his arms behind his back. The lawyer, who prided himself on finding every hidden loophole, realized his escape route to the Cayman Islands was permanently severed. The iron cuffs sealed his fate. He would be disbarred, disgraced, and imprisoned. The realization shattered his stoic facade. Carter broke down weeping openly, his sobs echoing pathetically as the agents dragged him away from the table. His tailored jacket bunched awkwardly around his shoulders, a final indignity for a man who worshipped appearances. Spencer remained kneeling on the floor, his breath hitching in his throat. He waited for the heavy hand of a federal agent to grab his shoulder. He braced himself for the cold steel of the handcuffs. He squeezed his eyes shut, anticipating the reading of his rights. The grab never came. Spencer opened his eyes, blinking through his tears. The agents were marching his father and brother-in-law toward the exit, entirely ignoring him. He looked up at me, confusion warring with the terror etched across his features. "You are not going in handcuffs today, Spencer," I stated, my voice cutting through the chaotic noise of the raid. I kept my tone clinical, devoid of any soothing cadence. "When I audited your offshore ledgers, I noticed a very specific structural anomaly. Your father is an arrogant man, but he possesses a twisted sense of familial protection. He orchestrated the wire transfers and authorized the forged liquidity metrics, but he deliberately kept your signature off the most damning federal documents. He wanted to shield his heir from potential fallout. From a strictly legal standpoint regarding the embezzlement, the regulatory agencies lack the paper trail required to indict you." A fleeting spark of hope ignited in Spencer's eyes. He let out a shaky, wet gasp, believing he had miraculously survived the slaughter. He thought he was walking away unscathed, ready to rebuild his life using whatever hidden trust funds he could salvage. He assumed he had outsmarted the system one last time. That spark was the exact vulnerability I needed to deliver the final strike. I stepped away from the executive chair and walked around the massive table. My heels clicked against the slate, measuring the distance until I stood looming over his cowering form. I reached into the portfolio resting on my desk and retrieved a thick stack of premium legal paper. I tossed the document onto the floor. The pages fanned out, landing directly on the tips of his expensive leather shoes. Spencer stared down at the paperwork. He recognized the heavy stock and the specific binding. It was the predatory post-nuptial agreement he and Carter had ambushed me with at the local coffee shop. The same contract they had tossed at me along with a cheap plastic pen, demanding I sign away my modest personal savings to protect their supposed empire. "You forced me to sign that contract, Spencer," I reminded him, watching his eyes dart across the visible clauses. "You threatened to bury me in endless litigation if I refused. You thought you were stripping me of marital assets, ensuring I would leave our marriage with nothing but the clothes on my back." Spencer frowned, his brain struggling to comprehend why I was presenting a document that favored him. "But you failed to read the fine print your own lawyer drafted," I explained, delivering the poetic justice with surgical precision. Carter included a reciprocal liability waiver. The clause explicitly states that upon the dissolution of our marriage, both parties permanently waive all rights to each other's assets. Crucially, it also dictates that each party assumes sole responsibility for their individual debts and financial liabilities. By forcing my signature, you legally severed me from your impending doom. The color vanished from Spencer's face once again. He reached out with a trembling hand, pulling the contract closer, reading the specific legal jargon he had previously ignored. Since Vanguard Apex acquired your parent holding company this morning, we conducted an immediate restructuring of your corporate debt. I continued, my words landing like heavy stones. Your father shielded you from the federal wire fraud, but he listed you as the primary guarantor on the commercial real estate loan in upstate New York. The project is a catastrophic failure. The development is sinking into the mud, and the balloon payment is officially in default. Spencer dropped the contract, letting out a wretched, suffocating gasp. Because you forced this post-nuptial agreement into effect, you are legally bound to 100% of that toxic liability, I declared, looking down at his ruined posture. You owe the creditors over $80 million. Your personal accounts are frozen. Your equity is erased. The bank will foreclose on your Manhattan penthouse before sunset. You will be stripped of your luxury vehicles, your club memberships, and your designer wardrobe. You wanted to leave me on the street? Instead, you engineered your own absolute poverty. He stared at the floor, the magnitude of his ruin crushing his spirit. He had avoided federal prison only to be sentenced to a lifetime of inescapable, crushing debt. He was entirely bankrupted, homeless, and utterly alone. His former high society friends would treat him like a contagious disease. He possessed no marketable skills to secure employment outside his father's shadow. I turned my back on him, walking toward the sweeping glass windows overlooking the city. The security personnel stepped forward, hauling Spencer off his knees. His legs refused to support his weight. He hung suspended between the guards, his bespoke suit dragging against the polished stone as they hauled him toward the exit. He did not shout or beg. He was reduced to a hollow shell, his vocal cords paralyzed by the sheer terror of his new reality. I stood by the window watching the reflection in the glass as the 3 Caldwell men were paraded out of my executive suite like common criminals. Their false superiority built on stolen money and unearned privilege was pulverized by the authentic power they had so drastically underestimated. The heavy oak doors swung shut, sealing the boardroom in pristine, victorious silence. The toxic chapter of my Manhattan existence was officially closed, paving the way for a genuine empire built on my own terms. 6 months later, the frantic, suffocating energy of Manhattan felt like a distant, irrelevant memory. I stood on the sweeping stone balcony of my newly restored estate, breathing in the crisp, untainted air of the Finger Lakes region. The transition from the sterile glass canyons of the financial district to this tranquil expanse of ancient pines and deep, still water marked a profound shift in my existence. I was no longer playing a role. The quiet, unassuming wife who wore off-the-rack clothing to appease an arrogant dynasty was gone. I wore a tailored cream cashmere sweater, wrapping my hands around a steaming ceramic mug of dark roast coffee, watching the morning mist burn off the surface of the lake. The water mirrored the dawn sky, unbroken and perfectly still. I purchased this historic property using a fraction of my performance bonuses from the Vanguard Apex acquisition. The estate featured soaring timber beams, vast windows framing the Adirondack Mountains, and acres of untouched woodland. It projected authentic, quiet strength. It was a fortress built on my own terms, devoid of the performative, hollow extravagance that defined the Caldwell estate. The silence here was not the tense, suffocating quiet of a locked boardroom preparing for an execution. It was a rich, fulfilling peace. Every stone and wooden beam reflected a reality I forged through patience and lethal calculation. The liquidation of Caldwell Wealth Strategies proceeded with clinical, surgical efficiency. Once the federal tactical teams finished securing the hard drives and escrow ledgers, The Department of Justice wasted zero time building their indictments. The sheer volume of evidence I provided in my anonymous digital dossier left the defense attorneys with zero maneuvering room. Lawrence and Carter faced a swift, unforgiving federal judge. The patriarch who spent decades terrifying subordinates and projecting untouchable superiority wept openly during his sentencing hearing. His booming voice deteriorated into a pathetic, trembling whisper as the gavel fell. The courtroom offered zero sympathy for a man who funded his vanity by draining the life savings of vulnerable investors. Both men received lengthy federal prison sentences. They were stripped of their bespoke suits and forced into standard-issue drab uniforms, relocated to a maximum security facility far from the luxurious enclaves of the Upper East Side. Carter, the brilliant legal mind who thought he could outsmart global banking regulators and flee to the Cayman Islands, now spends his days sweeping the concrete floors of a prison cafeteria. His law license was permanently revoked, erasing his entire identity. Lawrence sits in a sterile cell, denied the adulation and fear he required to function. His legacy reduced to a cautionary tale taught in corporate ethics seminars. The walls of their confinement offer a daily reminder of the woman they severely underestimated. The fallout extended far beyond the prison walls, catching the Caldwell women in its unforgiving undertow. Victoria and Audrey built their entire existence on the currency of social dominance. They thrived on exclusion, utilizing their wealth to belittle anyone they deemed inferior. When the firm collapsed and the federal asset seizures drained their accounts, their elite network evaporated overnight. The prestigious country club revoked their memberships the moment the annual dues bounced. The high society peers who once attended their lavish charity galas treated them like a contagious disease, refusing their phone calls and crossing the street to avoid interacting with them. Their impenetrable social armor shattered into worthless pieces. Without the stolen funds to sustain their designer lifestyles, Victoria and Audrey were evicted from their sprawling Manhattan residence. They now occupy a cramped, dimly lit two-bedroom apartment in a decaying borough. The women who once mocked my modest background are forced to navigate crowded public transit and budget their grocery runs. Their days consist of haggling at local consignment shops, selling off the remnants of their jewelry and vintage handbags just to keep the lights on. They are exiles in their own city, suffocating under the weight of their profound irrelevance. The exquisite sting of their poverty is magnified by the knowledge that they can never return to the elite circles they once ruled. Yet the most exquisite poetic justice landed squarely on the shoulders of my former husband. Spencer managed to avoid federal handcuffs because his father deliberately kept his signature off the most damning wire transfers. He thought he escaped the slaughter. He failed to comprehend the lethal nature of the postnuptial agreement he forced me to sign. By invoking the reciprocal liability waiver, he tethered himself to the toxic debt of his failed upstate commercial real estate venture. The creditors swarmed, holding him personally responsible for the $80 million default. The trap he set for me became the exact mechanism of his own financial demise. He declared bankruptcy, but the ruin was only the beginning of his sentence. Destitute, homeless, and exiled from the corporate world, Spencer needed a way to survive. With his reputation incinerated, no reputable firm in New York would hire him. He eventually found employment at the exact location that triggered his family downfall. He now works as a low-level, minimum-wage property manager at the sinking commercial site. The man who wore limited-edition platinum watches and commanded luxury boardrooms spends his days wearing a neon safety vest, directing gravel trucks and logging maintenance reports in a muddy, freezing construction trailer. He is permanently anchored to the physical manifestation of his own arrogant failure, serving a life sentence of manual labor and inescapable poverty. Every time it rains, the mud swallowing the foundation of his unfinished project reminds him of the empire he threw away. He sleeps on a cheap mattress in a rented room, waking up before dawn to brave the bitter cold. The pristine hands that once signed away my livelihood are now calloused and blistered. He lives in a perpetual state of exhaustion, haunted by the memory of a wife who offered him genuine partnership, only to be met with his profound cowardice. I turned away from the balcony railing and walked back inside my sprawling office. The room smelled of polished cedar and fresh mountain air. I sat down at my heavy oak desk, opening a thick, leather-bound portfolio resting in the center of the workspace. The documents inside did not contain predatory legal traps or falsified liquidity metrics. They were grant applications for a new philanthropic initiative I recently launched through Vanguard Apex. The foundation was designed to empower young women entering the financial sector, providing them with the education and resources required to navigate environments dominated by toxic, arrogant men. I reviewed the final candidate profile, reading about a brilliant, unassuming analyst who needed seed capital to launch her independent firm. A quiet smile touched my lips. I reached for my heavy silver fountain pen, uncapping it with a smooth, decisive motion. I pressed the nib to the thick paper, signing my name to authorize the transfer of funds. The ink flowed perfectly, securing a future for someone who truly deserved it. Investing in the next generation of female architects felt like the ultimate victory lap, cementing a culture of empowerment that stood in stark contrast to the Caldwell philosophy of exploitation. I set the pen down and leaned back in my chair, looking out the soaring windows at the tranquil expanse of the Finger Lakes. I did not just survive the elitism and cruelty of the Caldwell dynasty. I fundamentally conquered it. I stripped away their false armor, exposing the rot beneath their curated facade, and left them to drown in the consequences of their own making. I built my empire quietly, relying on authentic intellect and unyielding patience. The woman they told to know her place now ruled a genuine legacy standing at the summit of a mountain no arrogant man could ever take away. Looking out over the pristine, mist-covered waters of the Finger Lakes, the silence of my new life offers a profound space for deep, uninterrupted reflection. The dust has finally settled on the Caldwell Empire. The scandalous headlines have faded into yesterday's news. The federal indictments have been filed and processed, and the towering glass boardroom where I orchestrated their total ruin is now just another high-yield asset in my portfolio. Yet beneath the thrilling veneer of corporate espionage, the frozen offshore accounts, and the spectacular financial revenge, a much deeper, more heartbreaking narrative lingers in the quiet corners of my mind. The destruction of Caldwell Wealth Strategies was not merely a tale of severe market over-leverage or arrogant business practices collapsing under their own weight. At its very core, it was a story about the catastrophic generational failure of parenting. Lawrence Caldwell did not just bankrupt a Wall Street firm. He fundamentally bankrupted his son's soul. As I reflect on the smoldering ashes of their dynasty, the true lesson of this ordeal transcends the cutthroat world of finance. It forces a harrowing examination of family responsibility, the long-term guidance we owe our children, and the dark, corrosive side of the modern American dream. In American culture, we are often sold a specific, heavily curated vision of legacy. We are conditioned by media, society, and history to believe that a parent's ultimate responsibility within a traditional family structure is to accumulate vast wealth, secure unshakable status, and pass down an impenetrable fortress of privilege to their offspring. Lawrence Caldwell was a master architect of this grand illusion. He provided his son Spencer with bespoke suits, elite country club memberships, and an unearned, inflated title at a prestigious firm. He gave him every conceivable material advantage that money could buy. But in his ruthless pursuit of financial supremacy, He starved his son of the very elements that forge a functional, resilient human being: honesty, fairness, and profound emotional awareness. Lawrence taught his son that vulnerability was a dangerous liability, and that empathy was a fatal weakness reserved only for the lower classes. He modeled a life where the truth was highly malleable, easily discarded in favor of a doctored ledger, a forged signature, or a convenient lie. When a parent systematically shields a child from the natural consequences of their actions, when they use their wealth and influence to erase mistakes, rather than using those mistakes as vital teaching moments, they are not protecting the child. They are, in fact, abandoning them. Spencer grew into a hollow, cowardly man, fundamentally incapable of navigating adversity, because he was never once allowed to experience the heavy, grounding weight of genuine accountability. His moral compass was shattered long before I ever handed him that revised, devastating divorce decree. A healthy traditional family structure must be rooted in something far more durable than financial capital. It requires the arduous, ongoing, and often painful work of cultivating emotional awareness. Emotional awareness is the ability to look inward, to recognize our own flaws with unflinching honesty, and to possess the courage to make amends when we have caused harm. It is the true bedrock of fairness. Had Spencer possessed even a fraction of this emotional awareness, he might have recognized the profound emptiness of his father's toxic worldview. He might have seen the invaluable worth in a wife who loved him for his character rather than his proximity to $1 billion trust fund. Instead, he was raised in an isolated echo chamber of narcissism. In families like the Caldwells, children are rarely treated as independent individuals. They are treated as extensions of the patriarch's ego livestock, bred merely to carry the family name and project an unending image of elite supremacy. In such environments, there is zero room for honesty, because honesty inevitably exposes the rot festering beneath the polished floorboards. When parents prioritize appearances over authenticity, they impart a devastating lesson they teach their children: that their worth is strictly conditional. Spencer learned that to be loved by his father, he had to be ruthless. He learned that women were disposable props, and that anyone standing outside their elite circle was fundamentally subhuman. This profound lack of emotional guidance did not just make him a terrible husband, it made him a broken man, entirely unequipped to survive the moment his unearned armor was stripped away. Lawrence famously told me to know my place, attempting to use a rigid, class-based hierarchy to force my psychological submission. But a true parent, a guardian who understands the immense, sacred weight of guiding a child through the complexities of American life, teaches a vastly different definition of that phrase. They teach their children that their place is wherever their integrity, their relentless hard work, and their deep compassion can take them. They teach them that true power does not roar from a podium at a charity gala. Rather, it sits quietly in the dark, doing the right thing when no one else is watching. If you have ever navigated the treacherous, emotionally draining waters of a toxic family dynamic, or if you simply believe in the profound power of breaking generational curses to rewrite our own legacies, I encourage you to subscribe and follow Emily Told Stories. We must continue to share these narratives, shedding a necessary light on the quiet battles fought behind closed doors, and celebrating the incredible strength it takes to walk away from those who refuse to value our inherent worth. We are relentlessly told by society that a parent's greatest duty is to provide a better life for their children, which usually translates to an easier, more comfortable life. We strive to remove the obstacles we faced, to pave their roads with gold, and to cushion their inevitable falls with safety nets, woven from our own sacrifices. But looking at the tragic self-inflicted destruction of Spencer Caldwell, a much darker, highly unconventional truth emerges from the wreckage. Ease is a lethal poison when it is uncoupled from accountability. Giving a child a life devoid of struggle, where wealth and status insulate them from fairness and honesty, is not a blessing. It is the ultimate form of cruelty. We think we are building magnificent fortresses to protect our children from the harshness of the world, but more often than not, we are merely constructing the very prisons that will eventually suffocate them. We raise them to be emperors of dirt, ruling over fragile kingdoms that will inevitably collapse the moment a real, unyielding storm hits. To truly love a child is to ruthlessly deny them the privilege of a consequence-free existence. Because when the money evaporates, when the bespoke suits are stripped away, and the prestigious titles are erased, the only thing left standing is character. You cannot buy character. You must earn the scars that build it. Look closely at the empire you are building for your own family and ask yourself a terrifying question. Are you raising a child who can weather the storm? Or are you just raising the storm?